The ropes groaned against their pulleys as Marcus Atilius Regulus descended inch by inch toward the cauldron of bubbling oil below. The Carthaginian engineers had spent 3 days perfecting the mechanism. Every rope, every counterweight, every metal joint had been tested and retested. This wasn't some barbarian execution. This was calculated vengeance, measured out in precise increments of suffering. The oil didn't bubble like water. It moved thick and sluggish, occasionally releasing a burst of vapor that made even the guards step back. Regulus hung suspended in the wooden frame, his arms stretched wide by chains, his body bearing the marks of 5 days of preliminary torture. The spikes embedded in the barrel they'd rolled him in had left patterns across his back that wept blood with each labored breath. The crowd pressed closer, their murmuring creating a low hum that competed with the creaking wood. Carthaginian nobles in purple-trimmed robes occupied the raised platform, their faces masks of grim satisfaction. Below them, common citizens jostled for position, children hoisted on shoulders to witness the fate of the Roman who had humiliated their city. The executioner checked the mechanism one final time, running his hand along the rope that controlled the descent. His assistant monitored the oil temperature with a long metal rod, nodding when it reached the prescribed heat. Everything had been orchestrated to extend the spectacle, to make the twice-consul of Rome understand what it meant to break faith with Carthage. How does a Roman consul who once commanded 140,000 men end up suspended over boiling oil? And why did he deliberately choose this fate when multiple chances for escape lay open before him? To understand how honor became a death sentence, we need to rewind 5 years to when Marcus Atilius Regulus stood at the height of Roman power, about to make the decision that would seal his gruesome fate. The morning sun caught on 15,000 Roman spear points as Marcus Atilius Regulus surveyed the walls of Carthage from his command tent. The siege had lasted months, but now the great merchant city cowered before Roman might. His legions controlled every road, every supply line, every hope of relief. The harbour that once launched 1,000 trading vessels now held only Roman warships, their bronze rams glinting like teeth in the dawn light. Inside his tent, Regulus studied the map spread across his campaign table. Red markers showed Roman positions surrounding the city in an iron grip. His officers stood silent as he traced potential assault routes with one finger. The scratch of his stylus on wax tablets recorded casualties that meant nothing to him anymore. Victory was mathematics now. Time plus pressure equaled submission. The Carthaginian envoys had come 3 times already, each delegation more desperate than the last. Their purple robes dragged in the dust as they prostrated themselves before his tribunal. Gold, they offered. Territory. Trade agreements that would make Rome rich beyond measure. Regulus had listened to each proposal with the patience of a cat watching a mouse exhaust itself. His terms never changed. Total surrender. The destruction of the Carthaginian fleet. Every warship burned, every military harbour filled with stones. The great walls of Carthage torn down to their foundations. An indemnity so massive it would take 3 generations to pay. The aristocrats who had voted for war handed over in chains. The translator's voice had cracked as he relayed these demands to the Carthaginian Senate. Inside their council chamber, the silence that followed felt like a physical weight. These weren't terms. This was annihilation wrapped in the language of diplomacy. Even Roman allies in the Senate back home might have balked at such harshness. But Regulus had spent 2 years bleeding his way across North Africa. He'd lost friends to Carthaginian elephants and Numidian cavalry. He'd watched good Roman boys die screaming in the desert sand. Mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when total victory lay within his grasp. His quartermaster reported the morning's numbers. Carthage had perhaps 2 weeks of grain remaining. The aqueducts Regulus had cut meant water was already being rationed. Disease would follow hunger as surely as crows followed armies. Time was his greatest weapon now, more devastating than any battering ram. In the harbour district, something was happening. His scouts reported unusual activity around the foreign quarter, ships arriving under cover of darkness, their origins carefully obscured. Regulus dismissed the reports. What could a few merchant vessels matter when he commanded 15,000 veterans? The Carthaginian negotiators returned that afternoon, their faces gaunt with sleepless nights. This time they brought children, sons and daughters of senators, offered as hostages to guarantee good faith. The youngest couldn't have been more than 8, standing straight despite trembling legs, trying to show Roman dignity in Carthaginian veins. Regulus didn't even look at them. His demands hadn't changed, wouldn't change. The city would accept complete humiliation or face complete destruction. There was no middle ground in his mind, no space for compromise that might let Carthage rise again in 20 years to threaten Roman interests. His senior centurion, a scarred veteran named Lucius, shifted uncomfortably during the negotiations. Later, in private, he voiced what others were thinking. The terms were too harsh. Push too hard and desperate men might choose death over dishonor. Leave them nothing and they'd fight with the fury of the condemned. But Regulus had already won too much to settle for partial victory. 2 consular commands. Triumph through the Forum. His name carved in marble alongside Rome's greatest generals. This would be his masterpiece. The final stroke that established Roman dominance across the Mediterranean forever. That night, while Regulus drafted his report to the Senate, a different kind of vessel slipped into Carthage's harbour. No merchant ship this, but a lean warship flying no colours. Its passengers disembarked in shadows, moving with the practiced stealth of professionals who understood their business. The leader stood apart from the others. Where they moved like soldiers, he moved like a teacher studying a problem. His cloak bore no insignia, but the deference shown by Carthaginian officers marked him as someone of significance. In the weak light of harbour torches, his features remained obscured. Inside the city, the Carthaginian Senate convened in emergency session. The arrival had stirred something in the defeated atmosphere. Voices that had advocated surrender now fell silent as a new proposal circulated. Not from their own generals, who had failed so spectacularly, but from someone offering a different perspective entirely. The stranger requested maps, not just of the current siege lines, but of every battle Regulus had fought in Africa, every Roman victory laid out like a lesson plan. He studied them through the night, making notes in a script that wasn't Carthaginian. Sometimes he would pause, tap a location, and mutter something that made the Carthaginian generals exchange glances. Dawn brought new energy to the besieged city. Orders flew through the streets. Soldiers who had been preparing for surrender found themselves drilling with renewed purpose. The stranger walked among them, adjusting formations with small gestures that somehow changed everything. Where Carthaginian tradition had failed, perhaps foreign innovation might succeed. Regulus noticed the change from his command position. The city walls showed more activity. The defenders moved with better coordination. His morning attack probes met stiffer resistance than expected. Small things, but a general who had won as much as Regulus learned to read such signs. His interrogators worked on captured prisoners, seeking intelligence about what had changed. The answers came in fragments. A new advisor, foreign expertise, someone who had studied Roman methods and found their weaknesses. The prisoners didn't know details, but their renewed confidence spoke volumes. The name finally reached Regulus's tent on the lips of a dying Carthaginian officer, Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary who had fought across the Greek world before taking Carthaginian gold, a student of warfare who approached battle like a mathematician solving equations. As Regulus drafted what he believed would be Carthage's final surrender documents, a foreign mercenary was studying every military mistake he'd ever made. The Carthaginian generals laughed when the Spartan mercenary claimed he could destroy Rome's greatest army. Their laughter died when he showed them how. Xanthippus spread the battle reports across the council table like a physician examining symptoms of disease. Each Roman victory told the same story. Carthaginian commanders had fought the wars their grandfathers taught them, while Romans adapted, evolved, conquered. The Spartan's finger traced patterns in the defeats that made seasoned generals shift uncomfortably in their seats. He spoke softly, forcing them to lean forward. Words carried more weight when men had to strain to hear them. The problem wasn't courage. Carthaginian soldiers had died bravely in every battle. The problem was doctrine frozen in amber, while enemies learned new dances of death. The silence that followed felt different from the despair of previous councils. This wasn't the hush of defeat, but the quiet before understanding. One general, his arm still bound from wounds at Edese, asked the first intelligent question anyone had posed in months. How did Romans keep winning when Carthaginians had superior cavalry, elephants, and defensive positions? Xanthippus smiled for the first time since entering the city. The answer lay in the question itself. Carthage fought with separate pieces, while Rome fought as a single organism. Watch any Roman legion, he explained, and you saw 10,000 men breathing as one. Watch Carthaginian forces, and you saw cavalry, infantry, and elephants operating in proximity but not in concert. The transformation began that afternoon. Veterans who had survived multiple defeats found themselves relearning basics under Spartan instruction. Formation drills that seemed elementary revealed sophisticated purposes. The placement of each unit suddenly mattered in ways they'd never grasped. Space between formations became as important as the formations themselves. Elephant handlers received new instructions that contradicted generations of tradition. Instead of mass charges meant to shatter enemy lines, Xanthippus positioned them as mobile fortresses, anchors around which cavalry could wheel and reform. The beasts seemed to understand the change, their movements becoming more deliberate, less frantic. The Spartan walked among common soldiers as much as officers. His questions probed not just what they'd been taught, but why they believed it worked. Many couldn't answer. Tradition had replaced thought. Xanthippus made them think, made them see patterns where before they'd seen only chaos and Roman shields. Night drills replaced wine and despair. The sound of marching feet echoed through streets that had grown accustomed to funeral wails. Citizens peered from windows at soldiers moving with renewed purpose. The mechanical precision wasn't Roman, wasn't traditionally Carthaginian. It was something new, birthed from necessity and foreign expertise. Carthaginian cavalry commanders found their entire doctrine under assault. For generations, they'd been taught that horsemen were the hammer and infantry, the anvil. Xanthippus reversed it. Infantry would be the trap, cavalry the closing jaws. The metaphor made sense once he walked them through the geometry of battle. In the harbour, workshops that had prepared surrender gifts now forged new weapons. Not revolutionary designs, but standard arms manufactured to exacting specifications. Xanthippus measured spear lengths personally, ensuring each matched his calculations. Details that seemed trivial would matter when formation spacing determined survival. The merchant princes who funded Carthage's armies initially resisted spending gold on a lost cause. The Spartans' demonstration changed their minds. Using civilian volunteers, he showed how traditional Carthaginian tactics would fail against Roman discipline. Then he showed his alternative. The silence after his mock battle felt like prayer. Veterans studied their new commander with curiosity tinged by hope. Greeks had been teaching warfare to others for centuries, but this felt different. Xanthippus didn't impose Spartan methods wholesale. He adapted, blended, created something unique to Carthage's strengths. The fusion energized soldiers who'd grown tired of losing the same way. Roman deserters in Carthaginian service provided crucial intelligence. Under Xanthippus's questioning, they revealed details their previous interrogators had missed. Not grand strategies, but tiny habits. How Romans communicated during battle, the rhythm of their formations, the blind spots in their seemingly invincible manipular system. The city's mood shifted like tide turning. Markets that had hoarded food against siege now bustled with military suppliers. Women who had prepared funeral shrouds switched to mending military cloaks. Children played at being soldiers again, but now they drilled in the new formations they'd seen their fathers practicing. Xanthippus scheduled the army's first major exercise for the following week, not against Romans but against themselves. Half would fight as they'd always fought, half would use the new tactics. The demonstration would either validate his theories or expose him as another foreign opportunist selling false hope. Scouts reported these changes to Regulus, who dismissed them as desperation masked in activity. Cities under siege often experienced brief surges of energy before final collapse. His subordinates weren't as certain. The quality of resistance during probing attacks had improved. Carthaginian patrols moved with disturbing efficiency. The Spartans spent evenings with elephant handlers, learning each beast's temperament. What frightened them, what enraged them, how they responded to specific sounds and movements. Traditional Carthaginian doctrine treated them as living battering rams. Xanthippus saw them as psychological weapons whose greatest impact came before physical contact. His reforms extended beyond battlefield tactics. Supply lines, medical services, communication systems all received attention. Wars weren't won by single brilliant maneuvers, but by hundreds of small advantages accumulating into overwhelming force. Carthaginian officers who'd focused only on glory found themselves studying logistics. Religious ceremonies took on new significance. Xanthippus understood that soldiers needed to believe gods favored their cause. He participated in rituals to Baal and Tanit, showing respect for Carthaginian traditions while weaving in references to divine support for innovation. The priests, initially suspicious, became allies when they saw renewed faith in their congregations. The transformation wasn't without resistance. Senior commanders who'd built careers on traditional methods found their authority challenged by foreign ideas. Some attempted to undermine the reforms through bureaucratic obstruction. Xanthippus handled them with political skill that surprised those who'd expected only military expertise. Young officers embraced change more readily. They'd seen friends die following old patterns and welcomed any alternative to repeating those failures. Under Xanthippus's guidance, they became evangelists for the new methods, spreading enthusiasm through ranks that had grown cynical about leadership. Physical training intensified beyond anything Carthaginian soldiers had experienced. The Spartan demanded endurance that matched Roman standards. Men who'd relied on superior equipment learned to trust their conditioning. The weak fell away. Those who remained grew harder, more confident in their transformed capabilities. Communication drills consumed hours each day. Xanthippus introduced signal systems that allowed instant coordination across vast battlefields. Flags, horns, and drums became languages spoken fluently by every unit. The cacophony of practice annoyed citizens but promised deadly efficiency in combat. Carthaginian metallurgists received specifications for modified weapons. Nothing revolutionary, just refinements based on observed Roman vulnerabilities. Spear points designed to penetrate specific gaps in legionary armor. Sword balances calculated to exploit weaknesses in Roman fighting stances. Small advantages that would matter when multiplied across thousands of warriors. The first full demonstration exceeded expectations. Veterans who'd fought Romans unsuccessfully for years watched traditional Carthaginian forces crumble before the new tactics. The geometric precision of coordinated units moving as one entity created openings that cavalry exploited with devastating effect. Elephants didn't charge blindly but maneuvered like chess pieces, each movement calculated to create maximum disruption. Word spread through the city like fire. The impossible had become possible. Conversations in markets and temples shifted from planning submission to discussing victory. Mothers who'd hidden their sons from recruiters now encouraged enlistment. The spirit Regulus had worked so hard to crush rekindled from unexpected sparks. Xanthippus used success to demand more resources. Every advantage required investment. Better equipment cost gold. Extended training meant feeding soldiers longer. The merchant princes who controlled Carthage's wealth calculated risks against potential rewards. The equations had changed. Survival seemed possible. Victory, perhaps achievable. Night after night, the Spartans studied Regulus specifically. Every battle the Roman had won revealed patterns of thought, preferences in tactics, habitual responses to threats. Great generals often became predictable through their very success. They repeated what worked until someone found the counter. The army that assembled for final preparations bore little resemblance to the demoralized force that had cowered behind city walls. Discipline radiated from their movements. Confidence showed in their bearing. They'd internalized not just new tactics, but new belief in their capabilities. Carthage had remembered how to be dangerous. Xanthippus chose the battlefield carefully. Not the open plains where Romans traditionally dominated, but terrain that amplified his innovations. Every hill, every depression in the ground factored into his calculations. He would force Regulus to fight where Roman advantages meant less and Carthaginian adaptations meant more. Supply wagons rolled out in darkness, establishing forward positions where the transformed army would make its stand. Citizens lined the streets to watch, some weeping, others cheering. The mechanical precision of departure contrasted with the chaotic retreats they'd witnessed before. This looked like an army that expected to return. In his command tent, Xanthippus made final adjustments to deployments. Each unit had specific instructions that integrated with a master plan he kept locked in his mind. Tomorrow would test whether foreign innovation could overcome Roman inevitability. His stylus moved across wax tablets with the certainty of someone who'd calculated every variable. When dawn broke over Tunis, Regulus would face an enemy he no longer recognized. The morning mist clung to the ground like a burial shroud as 90 war elephants emerged from the haze, their breathing creating small clouds in the cool air. Each exhalation sounded like a blacksmith's bellows, rhythmic and deep, growing louder as the beasts advanced in perfect formation. The Roman sentries heard them before the fog revealed their massive shapes, grey mountains of flesh and ivory moving with impossible coordination. Regulus stood on a small rise overlooking his assembled legions, 15,000 men arranged in the triple lines that had conquered half the known world. The standard deployment felt as natural as breathing to these veterans. Hastati in front, young men eager to prove themselves. Principes behind them, experienced soldiers in their prime. Triarii in reserve, grizzled veterans who'd seen enough war to know when something felt wrong. The ground trembled slightly with each synchronized step of the approaching elephants. Not the wild charge Roman military manuals described, but measured advancement that spoke of absolute control. Between the war beasts, Carthaginian infantry marched in formations that seemed familiar yet alien, as if someone had taken Roman discipline and twisted it into something new. Carthaginian cavalry appeared on both flanks like mercury flowing across glass, their movements too fluid, too coordinated for the enemies Regulus had been crushing for 2 years. The horsemen held position instead of charging, waiting with patience that veteran Roman officers found deeply unsettling. This wasn't the Carthaginian army they'd bled white at Addis. The Roman trumpets sounded their traditional signals, but the noise felt thin against the overwhelming sensory assault of the approaching host. Behind the elephants, more infantry appeared through the mist, their spear points catching the early sun in rippling waves. The numerical advantage Regulus had counted on evaporated as unit after unit materialized from the haze. Scouts had reported 20,000. This looked closer to 30. Commands echoed across Roman lines, as centurions adjusted formations to meet the unusual deployment. The mechanical precision that had won empire stuttered against uncertainty. Veterans who'd faced elephants before found their usual tactics challenged by beasts that refused to behave predictably. The great animals halted just outside pilum range, breathing steadily, waiting. A single horn note rolled across the battlefield, unlike any signal in Roman or traditional Carthaginian usage. The elephants responded instantly, spreading wider, creating gaps between them that infantry began filling. Not the chaotic rush Romans expected, but deliberate positioning that turned each elephant into a mobile fortress. Regulus felt his throat constrict as he recognized the tactical sophistication unfolding before him. The Carthaginian commander emerged from the mist on foot, walking among his troops with casual confidence. Even at distance, his foreign bearing marked him as the Spartan mercenary intelligence had warned about. He moved through formations, making minor adjustments, each gesture producing immediate response from disciplined units. The Roman formation that had never failed suddenly buckled under the weight of approaching inevitability. Regulus ordered his light infantry forward to disrupt the enemy deployment before it fully materialized. The velites advanced with practiced efficiency, hurling javelins at maximum range. Their missiles struck Carthaginian shields that locked together in overlapping patterns, creating walls that channeled Roman skirmishers into killing zones. The screams started immediately. Carthaginian slingers appeared between elephant units, their lead bullets whistling through air with deadly accuracy. Roman light troops fell back in disorder, some crawling with shattered limbs, others lying still where Balearic lead had found gaps in their protection. The elephants hadn't even engaged yet, but Roman blood already darkened foreign soil. The main battle lines closed with grinding inevitability. Hastati advanced in their manipular formation, gaps between units allowing tactical flexibility that had dominated every battlefield for generations. The Carthaginian infantry received them not with the loose formations of past encounters, but with something that looked disturbingly like Roman discipline married to foreign innovation. Shields locked, spears leveled. The clash of metal on metal created a wall of sound that drowned individual screams. Roman soldiers found themselves fighting reflections in a twisted mirror. Where they expected Carthaginian lines to buckle under disciplined pressure, enemy formations bent without breaking. Gaps that should have allowed Roman penetration became traps as cavalry swept in from flanks with timing too perfect for coincidence. The geometry of battle had changed, and Romans were solving yesterday's equations. The elephants moved at last, not in the massed charge military doctrine prescribed, but as individual units supporting infantry advances. Each beast became a mobile tower from which arrows and javelins rained with devastating effect. Roman formations that had learned to channel charging elephants through gaps found those same gaps turned into death traps by coordinated enemy movement. Everything they'd been taught to do made their situation worse. Regulus sent his principes forward earlier than doctrine suggested, trying to restore momentum through sheer weight of experienced troops. These men had conquered from Sicily to Africa, but they advanced into something beyond their experience. The Carthaginian centre yielded gradually, drawing Romans deeper into a formation that felt increasingly like jaws preparing to close. Warning shouts from centurions came too late. The trap revealed itself with mathematical precision. Carthaginian wings pivoted inward, while the centre continued its controlled withdrawal. Roman units that had pushed forward found themselves surrounded on three sides. Their own success turned into catastrophe. Elephants that had seemed randomly positioned now blocked every escape route. The sounds of triumph transformed into panic as soldiers realized their predicament. Numidian cavalry struck the Roman rear like hammers against anvils, their timing coordinated to the heartbeat. Supply trains burst into flames. Reserve positions crumbled under assault from horsemen who appeared and vanished like smoke. The Triarii, Rome's ultimate reserve, found themselves fighting for survival instead of advancing to restore the battle line. Everything unraveled with nightmarish speed. Individual Roman sentries fought with desperate valor, forming square against attacks from every direction. Their discipline held even as hope evaporated. Centurions died at their posts. Standard-bearers fell defending eagles that would never see Rome again. The mechanical efficiency of destruction ground on as Carthaginian units rotated fresh troops through the slaughter with professional detachment. A war elephant decorated with purple and gold advanced directly toward Regulus's command position, not charging but walking with deliberate intent, arrows from its tower clearing defenders like wheat before scythes. The consul's bodyguard formed around him, their shields creating temporary sanctuary against the storm of projectiles. Behind the elephant, Carthaginian heavy infantry advanced in lockstep, their spears leveled at Roman hearts. The Spartan commander appeared through smoke and chaos, still on foot, still adjusting formations with small gestures. His economy of movement contrasted with the frantic energy of Romans trying to salvage disaster. Where Regulus screamed orders that disappeared in battlefield noise, Xanthippus communicated through predetermined signals that produced instant response. The student of war had become its master. Roman standards began falling across the field, each lost eagle representing another century destroyed or scattered. Soldiers who dreamed of Carthaginian gold now trampled their own standards, fleeing toward safety that didn't exist. Carthaginian cavalry turned retreat into rout, riding down fugitives with mechanical efficiency. The greatest Roman army in Africa dissolved like salt in rain. Regulus tried rallying survivors for final resistance, but coordination had shattered beyond recovery. Individual units fought separate battles for survival, their actions no longer part of any cohesive plan. The consul who demanded Carthage's complete humiliation watched his own forces suffer exactly that fate. Pride transformed into ash, as completely as his legions transformed into corpses. The elephant reached Regulus's position as his last defenders fell. Carthaginian infantry surrounded him with spear points that gleamed red in afternoon Sunday. He drew his sword, preparing for the warrior's death that would at least preserve some honor. The Spartan's voice cut through battlefield cacophony, speaking words in accented Latin that froze Regulus mid-motion. Not death, not yet. Carthage had different plans for Rome's twice consul. The chains were bronze, heavy enough to show respect for his rank while ensuring no possibility of escape. They locked around wrists still marked by the general's golden bracelets, the metal cold against skin slick with other men's blood. Regulus stood among the wreckage of everything he'd built, surrounded by Carthaginian soldiers who watched him with expressions mixing satisfaction and something else. As chains locked around his wrists, Regulus heard something that chilled him more than defeat Carthaginian laughter. The chains scraped against stone floors as Carthaginian guards dragged Regulus through corridors that stank of fear and human waste. 5 years stretched behind him like a road paved with calculated suffering. 5 years since Tunis. 5 years of darkness punctuated by pain so precise it felt like artistry. The cell they kept him in measured 6 paces by 4. No windows, no light, except what leaked through cracks when guards passed outside. The darkness pressed against his eyes until he forgot what colours looked like. Sometimes he'd wake convinced he'd gone blind, pouring at his face until he felt the crusted blood where eyelids used to be. Sleep became the enemy. Without eyelids, even closing his eyes brought no relief from whatever faint light existed. The burning started immediately, spreading from dried corneas through his skull like fire following oil. Guards would find him pressing palms against eye sockets, trying to create artificial darkness that never lasted long enough. They fed him just enough to keep him valuable. Thin gruel that tasted of salt and corruption pushed through a slot while he groped in darkness like an animal. Water came irregularly, sometimes fresh, sometimes fouled with substances that left him retching for hours. The calculations showed in every detail. Keep him alive, keep him suffering, keep him useful for the moment they'd planned since his capture. The torturer introduced himself on the 3rd day with professional courtesy. Not Carthaginian, but Egyptian, hired for expertise in keeping important prisoners balanced on the knife edge between death and madness. He explained his methods like a teacher sharing curriculum. The goal wasn't breaking Regulus completely. Broken men made poor messengers. The goal was crafting specific damage that would serve Carthage's purposes. Sleep deprivation formed the foundation of their program. Guards worked in shifts, ensuring noise erupted whenever Regulus approached unconsciousness. Metal rods dragged across stone. Water dripped with metronomic precision onto surfaces that amplified sound. When silence might have allowed rest, they introduced irregular crashes that jerked him awake, gasping. The human mind needed sleep like lungs needed air. Deny it systematically, and reality began fraying at the edges. The Egyptian noted each stage of deterioration in scrolls that would later guide similar programs. How long before hallucination started, when paranoia shifted from reasonable to delusional? The precise moment when a proud Roman consul began begging for death. Everything recorded with scientific detachment, knowledge preserved for future applications. Physical torture came in measured doses. Not the crude beatings of barbarians, but sophisticated applications of pain designed to leave specific impressions. The barrel filled with inward-pointing spikes that they rolled him in left scars arranged in patterns. Anyone seeing his back would know Carthaginian justice had been methodically applied. The wounds healed slowly, infected repeatedly, treated just enough to prevent death while maximizing suffering. They cut away his eyelids during the 2nd month. The Egyptian explained the procedure beforehand, professional pride demanding his victim understand the artistry involved. 2 assistants held Regulus's head immobile, while delicate blades removed what nature had provided for protection. The pain was secondary to the psychological impact. Never again would he escape into darkness. Even in death, his eyes would remain open, staring at whatever came next. Recovery brought new varieties of torment. Bright lights positioned to maximize discomfort. Drops of various solutions that burned already damaged eyes. The constant need to blink that could never be satisfied. Tears flowed continuously, his body trying to protect what couldn't be protected. The Egyptian adjusted treatments based on observed responses, refining techniques that pushed boundaries without crossing into blindness. Psychological warfare accompanied physical degradation. Guards spoke constantly about his family, mixing truth with lies, until Regulus couldn't distinguish between them. His wife had remarried. His sons had been killed in border skirmishes. Rome had declared him dead, and erected monuments to his memory. The Senate had condemned his name. Every story calculated to erode whatever mental foundations remained. The interrogations served no intelligence purpose. Carthage already knew everything worth knowing about Roman military dispositions. Questions focused instead on personal humiliation. They made him recite his victories, then pointed out every mistake, every unnecessary death, every moment when pride had overcome wisdom. The systematic destruction of self-worth proceeded with therapeutic thoroughness. Months blended together in darkness, punctuated by agony. The Egyptian introduced new torments with academic enthusiasm, positions that stressed joints without breaking them, temperatures calculated to cause maximum discomfort without permanent damage, sounds at frequencies that bypassed ears to resonate in bones. Each innovation carefully tested, results meticulously recorded. Other prisoners sometimes occupied nearby cells. Regulus heard their screams, their pleading, their final silences. Whether real or performed for his benefit, he never knew. The uncertainty ate at sanity, already compromised by sleeplessness and pain. Sometimes he recognized voices, fellow Romans captured at Tunis. Sometimes the voices spoke languages that shouldn't exist, products of a mind creating its own torments. The Egyptian's assistant, a Numidian who'd learned his trade in Alexandria's medical schools, handled the more delicate procedures. He understood anatomy with surgeon's precision, knowing exactly where to cut, where to burn, where to apply pressure that would leave lasting impressions without permanent dysfunction. His contributions earned praise from his master and hatred from their subject. Seasons passed unmarked in perpetual darkness. Regulus measured time by the evolution of his suffering, each phase building on previous foundations. The physical torments became almost secondary to the psychological erosion. Without sleep, without hope, without even the mercy of closed eyes, the mind began eating itself. Rationality became a luxury he couldn't afford. They cleaned him periodically, maintaining their investment with practical efficiency. The baths brought temporary relief, followed by renewed torment as healing wounds were reopened, infections introduced, suffering recalibrated. Even mercy served their purposes, brief respites making subsequent pain more acute by contrast. The Egyptian departed after 2 years, his contract complete, knowledge transferred to Carthaginian successors. He bid farewell to Regulus with professional respect, acknowledging the consul's remarkable endurance. Lesser men would have died or gone irreversibly mad. Regulus had held on to enough sanity to remain useful, though the cost showed in features aged decades beyond their years. New torturers lacked their predecessors' sophistication but compensated with enthusiasm. Where the Egyptian had wielded pain like a scalpel, these men used clubs. The careful maintenance of Regulus's condition deteriorated into cruder applications of suffering. Bones broke and healed badly. Joints dislocated and were roughly reset. The artwork of agony became mere vandalism. Communication with guards revealed the passage of time through fragments of overheard conversation. Wars had been fought, treaties signed and broken. Rome and Carthage circled each other like wounded predators, neither able to deliver killing blows. The conflict that had consumed Regulus's life continued without him, his absence barely noticed in the larger dance of empires. Nutrition declined from calculated sustenance to mere survival rations. Weight fell from already gaunt frames, muscles atrophied. The proud consul who'd commanded legions became a scarecrow animated by stubbornness and suffering. Guards who remembered his arrival struggled to reconcile memory with current reality. The 5th year brought changes in atmosphere. New urgency infected his captors' behavior. Conversations included references to negotiations, diplomatic missions, leverage to be applied. Regulus found himself examined by officials who studied him like merchants evaluating damaged goods. Whatever purpose had preserved him through half a decade of torment was finally approaching. They improved his condition slightly. Better food appeared, though his shrunken stomach could barely process it. Wounds received actual treatment instead of deliberate aggravation. The cell gained a narrow window that admitted natural light, though eyes without lids could find no comfort in the view. These improvements felt more ominous than any torture. A Carthaginian diplomat visited, elderly and refined, speaking Latin with educated precision. He sat outside Regulus's cell, voice carrying through bars as he explained political developments. The war had ground to stalemate. Both sides bled resources they couldn't spare. Negotiations offered potential resolution, but trust remained absent between enemies who'd inflicted such mutual damage. The proposition emerged slowly, wrapped in diplomatic language that couldn't disguise its brutal simplicity. Carthage needed an envoy Rome would trust, someone whose word carried weight despite representing enemy interests, someone whose personal investment in ending conflict would be believed, someone who could argue for peace with credibility born from suffering. Regulus laughed for the first time in years, the sound cracking from disused throat like rusted hinges screaming. They wanted him to negotiate his own ransom, to travel to Rome and convince the Senate to accept terms that would free him from this hell. The perfect messenger, motivated by personal interest to achieve Carthaginian goals. The diplomat waited patiently through the laughter, then continued outlining terms: prisoner exchange rates, territorial concessions, trade agreements that would restore Carthaginian prosperity. All Regulus had to do was present these terms convincingly. Success meant freedom. Failure meant returning to darkness and pain. The choice seemed obvious to rational minds. But rationality had been burned away with his eyelids. What remained was something harder, more fundamental. Roman honor calcified by suffering into something beyond reason. Regulus listened to terms that would save his life, while part of him calculated how to turn this opportunity against its creators. The preparations took weeks. They cleaned him properly, treated infections, improved nutrition to restore minimal health. Tailors fitted robes that would hide the worst scarring while displaying enough damage to evoke sympathy. Every detail calculated to create maximum impact when Rome's twice-consul returned from the dead. Language lessons refreshed Latin roughened by years of screaming. They made him practice speeches, diplomatic phrases, the vocabulary of negotiation. His Carthaginian handlers showed patience born from investment. 5 years of keeping him alive had to produce returns. Their created messenger would deliver their message or return to suffer consequences that imagination could barely compass. The oath ceremony took place in Carthage's highest temple. Priests of Baal and Tanit presided over rituals binding Regulus with divine chains stronger than bronze. He swore on altars stained with sacrifice to return if negotiations failed, to accept whatever punishment Carthage decreed should he break faith. The gods themselves would enforce this bargain. Sacred words burned his throat as he spoke them. The priests nodded satisfaction while recording witnesses memorized every syllable. Magic or psychology, the oath carried weight that pressed against his chest like stones. Breaking such vows meant more than death. It meant divine vengeance pursuing his shade through whatever afterlife awaited. Carthaginian nobles attended the ceremony, their faces mixing satisfaction with unease. Using sacred oaths for political purposes risked divine displeasure, but desperation overruled caution. They needed this to work, needed Rome to accept terms that would let Carthage rebuild, needed their tortured messenger to value his own life above abstract principles. The final briefing covered every detail of his mission: which senators to approach first, how to frame arguments for maximum effect, the consequences of various negotiation outcomes. They spoke to him like a trusted ambassador rather than a prisoner, necessity forcing courtesy that fooled no one. Regulus memorized everything while planning how to subvert it. Ships prepared for the voyage to Rome. His escort would be minimal, enough to ensure delivery but not enough to seem threatening. Carthaginian diplomats would accompany him part way, then wait offshore while he conducted negotiations. Everything designed to show good faith while maintaining control. The night before departure, alone in a cell that had become his entire world, Regulus stared at stars through his small window. Eyes that couldn't close watched constellations wheel overhead while he considered the choice ahead. Return to Rome as Carthage's creature, arguing for his own freedom at the cost of Roman advantage. Or something else. Something that would transform diplomatic mission into different kind of victory. Guards came at dawn, bronze chains replacing the heavier iron that had worn grooves in his wrists. The gesture held symbolic meaning. Still prisoner, but trusted with mission. still bound but granted movement. The contradiction embodied everything about his situation. They led him through streets he hadn't seen in 5 years. Carthaginian citizens lined the route, curious about the Roman who'd survived their justice. Some spat. Others watched with expressions mixing hatred and respect. All understood they witnessed something unprecedented. No prisoner had endured what Regulus had endured. None had been offered what he'd been offered. The harbour stretched before him, ships waiting with sails furled. The same waters he'd once commanded with Roman vessels now offered passage home. But home to what purpose? To speak Carthaginian words with Roman voice? To purchase personal freedom with national disadvantage? The oath they'd made him swear seemed like mercy compared to the choice itself. As sailors prepared for departure, Regulus stood at the rail, lidless eyes fixed on the horizon where Rome waited. The oath they made him swear seemed like mercy, but Regulus knew it was a death sentence disguised as diplomacy. The ship's timbers groaned with each Mediterranean swell as Regulus stood at the rail, watching the Italian coastline emerge from morning haze. His escort of 3 Carthaginian guards maintained respectful distance, understanding their charge needed space to prepare for what lay ahead. The bronze chains around his wrists caught sunlight with every movement, their weight nothing compared to the oath binding his soul. Rome's harbour at Ostia appeared exactly as memory preserved it, though his damaged eyes struggled to resolve details. The familiar sounds reached him first: dock workers shouting in Latin, gulls fighting over fish scraps, wooden cranes creaking under heavy loads. His throat constricted at hearing his native tongue spoken freely after 5 years of Carthaginian consonants and Egyptian curses. The guards tensed as Roman naval vessels approached for inspection. Their orders covered this contingency, but theory and practice rarely aligned perfectly when enemies met at sea. Regulus listened to shouted challenges and diplomatic responses, noting how Roman sailors fell silent upon hearing his name. The impossible had substance. Marcus Atilius Regulus lived. Word travelled faster than their ship could navigate the Tiber. By the time they reached Rome proper, crowds had gathered along the riverbanks. The reaction wasn't celebration, but something more complex, mixing joy with horror as citizens glimpsed what Carthaginian hospitality had left of their twice consul. Mothers pulled children back from the water's edge, while veterans who'd served under him stood rigid with recognition and rage. The diplomatic protocols at the city gates took hours. Senate messengers verified his identity through questions only the real Regulus could answer. His Carthaginian escort presented documents explaining their peculiar mission, while Roman soldiers gripped spear shafts with white knuckles. The treaty negotiations existed in legal grey space, where neither war nor peace fully applied. Marcus's wife, Marcia, arrived as afternoon shadows lengthened, accompanied by formal Senate delegation. She'd aged gracefully in his absence, silver threading through hair he remembered as pure black. Their eyes met across the diplomatic barrier, and her carefully composed expression shattered. The sound she made wasn't quite scream nor sob, but something primal that made hardened soldiers look away. Protocol demanded formal reception before private reunion. They led him to temporary quarters in the Forum district, respectable lodging that acknowledged his status while maintaining subtle guard presence. The Carthaginian escort established their position nearby, close enough to monitor without seeming to threaten. Every detail had been negotiated in advance. The children waited inside, arranged by age as Roman custom demanded. Marcus Minor had grown from boy to young man, wearing the toga virilis Regulus had missed bestowing. Claudia stood with her mother's poise, though her hands trembled as she gripped her younger brother's shoulder. Little Gaius, who'd been barely walking when Regulus left for Africa, stared at this stranger claiming paternal connection. Marcia guided the reunion with desperate efficiency, bridging 5 years of absence through careful introductions. She spoke their father's name repeatedly, trying to help young Gaius connect memory with reality. The boy's confusion cut deeper than any torture as he pressed against his mother's side, seeking protection from this scarred apparition. The evening meal proceeded in strained formality. Regulus struggled with utensils after years of eating like an animal in darkness. His family watched him fumble with wine cups and bread, their own appetites vanishing as they catalogued visible damage. Conversation started and stopped like water finding its level, neither side knowing how to navigate this impossible situation. Marcus Minor finally broke the silence with questions about military matters, safe ground where father and son could meet as Romans. Regulus answered carefully, sharing enough to seem natural while avoiding anything that might compromise his mission. The young man's hero worship had survived 5 years of absence but strained against present reality. Night brought private conference with Marcia after children retreated to sleeping quarters. She examined his scars by lamplight, fingers tracing patterns that spoke of systematic cruelty. Neither wept. Romans of their class had been trained since childhood to endure with dignity. The silence between them held more pain than any words could express. She spoke of practical matters first, the family finances, managed competently in his absence, the children's education, proceeding according to plans they'd made together, the political situation, grown complex as various factions maneuvered for advantage. Everything reported with mechanical precision, while her eyes begged for explanations he couldn't provide. The truth emerged in fragments. His capture at Tunis, delivered without elaboration. The years of imprisonment, summarized in terms that revealed nothing of daily horror. The mission that brought him home, explained with careful attention to diplomatic requirements. She listened with the intelligence that had first attracted him, understanding the gaps in his narrative. Morning brought Senate summons, delivered with ceremony that acknowledged his peculiar status. Neither fully citizen nor enemy ambassador, he occupied unprecedented territory in Roman law. The senators who'd served with him during his consulships would sit in judgment of proposals he carried from their greatest enemy. His appearance in the Senate House produced audible reactions from men trained in stoicism. The formal toga concealed some damage but couldn't hide his skeletal frame or the unnatural stare of eyes that couldn't close. Several senators who'd known him since youth turned away, unable to reconcile memory with present reality. The Carthaginian proposals had been crafted by shrewd minds understanding Roman psychology. Prisoner exchanges favoring Carthage, but not unreasonably. Territorial adjustments that seemed minor but held strategic significance. Trade terms that would restore Carthaginian prosperity while appearing generous to Roman merchants. Every clause calculated to seem acceptable while serving enemy interests. Regulus presented each point with mechanical precision, fulfilling the letter of his oath. His voice carried across the silent chamber as he explained terms that would secure his freedom. The senators listened with growing discomfort, recognizing the trap Carthage had constructed. Accept and strengthen their enemy. Reject and condemn one of their own to continued torture. The formal presentation concluded with rehearsed phrases about peace bringing prosperity to both nations. Regulus stood before men he'd led in war, men who owed him loyalty and friendship, men who now held his life in their hands. The silence that followed felt heavier than chains as senators absorbed the impossible choice Carthage had forced upon them. Private consultations began immediately. Former colleagues approached with careful words, testing whether the proposals represented his genuine recommendation or mere recitation of captor demands. Each conversation danced around the central question none dared ask directly. Would Marcus Atilius Regulus, twice consul of Rome, really advocate terms that advantaged Carthage? The faction favoring peace seized upon his presence as divine providence. Here stood living proof that negotiation could succeed where war had stalled. They emphasized humanitarian concerns, painting rejection as condemning a Roman hero to further suffering. Their arguments gained strength from visible evidence of what that suffering had already entailed. Opposition voices spoke more quietly but with equal passion. Some saw Carthaginian manipulation in every clause, recognizing strategic advantages disguised as reasonable compromises. Others focused on precedent, warning that ransoming prominent captives would encourage future hostage-taking. The debate fractured along lines both political and personal. Regulus attended every session, sitting in designated space that emphasized his liminal status. He answered questions with technical precision when asked, but offered no personal advocacy beyond initial presentation. His silence spoke volumes to those skilled in reading political atmospheres. Something restrained him beyond diplomatic courtesy. Evening brought private meetings with family friends desperate to understand his true position. They offered wine he barely touched, and food that sat untasted as they probed for guidance. Some promised support regardless of his recommendation. Others hinted at arrangements that might secure his freedom through unofficial channels. All met the same mechanical responses that revealed nothing. His children visited daily, slowly warming to this strange father who'd returned so changed. Young Gaius began asking questions about scars, childish curiosity overcoming initial fear. Claudia demonstrated accomplishments in music and poetry, seeking approval from eyes that watched but couldn't truly see. Marcus Minor discussed his own military ambitions, unaware how each word twisted in his father's chest. Marcia managed household logistics around diplomatic requirements, creating islands of normalcy in an abnormal situation. She never asked about his true intentions, perhaps understanding that knowledge would bring its own burdens. Their conversations focused on immediate needs, while larger questions hung unspoken between them. Senate debate intensified as deadline approached. The Carthaginian escort grew restless, their diplomatic patience wearing thin as Roman democracy ground through its processes. They'd expected quick resolution driven by humanitarian concerns. Instead, they witnessed the machinery of republic processing their proposals with agonizing thoroughness. Rumors spread through Rome's streets about the returned consul and his mysterious mission. Some painted him as hero sacrificing for peace. Others whispered of broken men saying anything to escape continued torture. The mob that gathered outside Senate sessions reflected Rome's divided conscience, cheering and cursing with equal passion. Religious authorities weighed in with interpretations of divine will. Some saw his survival as gods demanding peace. Others argued that accepting terms under duress insulted Roman dignity. The priests of Mars reminded citizens that their god demanded victory, not negotiation. Temple debates grew heated as spiritual authority fractured along political lines. His guard escort maintained professional distance while monitoring every interaction. They understood enough Latin to follow major discussions, but relied on Regulus to interpret nuances. Their reports to Carthage would determine his fate regardless of Senate decisions. The oath that bound him served their purposes whether Rome accepted or rejected their terms. Time contracted as the designated response date approached. Senate leaders pressed for his personal recommendation, understanding that his words would sway undecided voters. The moment they'd all anticipated arrived with ceremony befitting its importance. Marcus Atilius Regulus would finally speak his mind about the proposals he'd carried from Carthage. The Senate House filled beyond capacity as word spread of his pending address. Former soldiers who'd served under him crowded galleries normally reserved for citizens of higher status. The collective breathing of hundreds created atmosphere thick with expectation. Whatever he said next would determine not just his fate but potentially the course of war itself. Regulus stood slowly, bronze chains catching light from high windows as he moved to the speaking position. His ravaged face turned toward assembled senators, lidless eyes scanning men who held power over his life. The silence grew absolute as Rome waited to hear whether their twice consul would argue for his own salvation. Tomorrow, Regulus would stand before Rome and argue for his own execution. The Senate House fell silent as Regulus rose from his bench, the scrape of his sandals against marble echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. Every eye fixed on the skeletal figure moving toward the speaker's platform, bronze chains catching the afternoon light filtering through clerestory windows. The weight of expectation pressed down harder than any torturer's implements, as hundreds of Rome's most powerful men waited for words that would shape the Republic's future. Regulus gripped the speaker's podium with hands that trembled not from fear but from muscles damaged by years of calculated abuse. The wood felt smooth and solid, grounding him in this moment when everything demanded he float away on diplomatic abstractions. Behind him, the Carthaginian observers shifted in their designated seats, styluses poised over wax tablets to record every syllable of what they expected to be their triumph. The first words emerged stronger than anyone anticipated, decades of senatorial training overcoming physical degradation. He thanked the assembly for receiving him, acknowledged the peculiar circumstances of his presence, established the formal protocols that tradition demanded. Each phrase built foundations for what would follow, stones laid with architectural precision while senators leaned forward, trying to read intent in a face that torture had stripped of subtle expression. Senator Fabius Maximus watched from the front benches, his weathered features tight with concentration, as he recognized something in Regulus's tone that others might miss. They'd served together as consuls, understood each other's methods, could read political intentions like augurs reading bird flights. The slight emphasis Regulus placed on certain words, the careful construction of seemingly routine phrases, all pointed towards something beyond simple recitation of Carthaginian demands. The formal presentation of terms continued with mechanical precision, each clause delivered exactly as rehearsed in Carthage's dungeons. Prisoner exchange ratios favoring the enemy, territorial concessions that seemed minor but held strategic value, trade agreements that would restore Carthaginian prosperity while Rome bled resources. The words tasted like ashes, but his oath demanded their utterance, and Marcus Atilius Regulus had never broken an oath. Young senators who'd risen to power during his absence shifted restlessly as terms accumulated like weights on a balance scale. They'd heard stories of Regulus's victories, studied his campaigns in their military education, held him as an example of Roman excellence. This recitation of enemy demands from their hero's lips created cognitive dissonance that showed in furrowed brows and whispered consultations with neighbors. The silence that followed his formal presentation stretched like a held breath across the chamber. Protocol demanded he stop there. Message delivered. Duty to captors fulfilled. The Carthaginian observers relaxed slightly, satisfied their messenger had performed as instructed. Several peace faction senators prepared to rise in support, ready to argue humanitarian necessity. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between what everyone expected and what would actually emerge. Regulus's grip on the podium tightened until his knuckles showed white through scarred skin. The next words would shatter every calculation Carthage had made, transform diplomatic mission into something else entirely. He drew breath deep into lungs that remembered screaming, felt the weight of his oath like physical chains, and began speaking words no one had anticipated. Honored senators, I have fulfilled my obligation to present Carthage's terms with complete accuracy. His voice carried new steel that made experienced politicians straighten in their seats. Now, as a citizen of Rome addressing the Senate, I must speak to their true meaning and consequence. The Carthaginian observers lurched forward, styluses dropping as they processed this deviation from script. Their senior diplomat half rose before protocol forced him back down, face darkening as he realized their perfectly crafted trap might close on different prey than intended. Murmurs rippled through Roman benches as senators grasped that something unprecedented was unfolding. These terms appear reasonable to casual examination, Regulus continued, each word placed with deliberation of a general positioning troops. Carthage counts on Roman mercy, on your desire to spare one who has suffered in service to the Republic. They believe personal sympathy will override strategic judgment. They are wrong. Senator Fabius stood abruptly, his movement drawing every eye as he recognized where this path led. Marcus Atilius, consider carefully what you say next. Think of your family, of yourself, of what awaits if you return to Carthage without success. The warning carried weight of friendship, of shared battles, of understanding exactly what his colleague was choosing. Regulus turned those lidless eyes toward his old friend, and something in his expression made Fabius sink back to his bench. The moment of interruption had given everyone time to grasp the full implications. Their twice consul was about to argue against his own freedom, against terms that would spare him return to torture, against every human instinct for self-preservation. I have considered, Fabius. For 5 years in darkness, I have considered little else. His voice dropped lower, forcing absolute attention. Now listen as I explain why Rome must reject these terms entirely, why you must send me back to certain death rather than accept Carthaginian poison dressed as mercy. The eruption of voices drowned whatever he might have said next. Senators shouted objections, demanded explanations, pleaded for reconsideration. The Carthaginian observers gestured frantically at their Roman handlers, demanding translation of the chaos, understanding only that their plan had gone catastrophically wrong. Through it all, Regulus stood motionless at the podium, waiting with patience learned through years of agony. Order restored itself gradually as senior senators exerted authority. The implications of what they were witnessing settled over the assembly like funeral cloth. Their colleague was signing his own death warrant, and they would be forced to watch him do it with legal precision that made intervention impossible. Several men who'd commanded legions found themselves gripping bench edges to keep from physically dragging him from the podium. The prisoner exchange appears balanced, but examine the numbers closely. Regulus resumed as if the interruption hadn't occurred. Carthage offers 100 of our captured citizens for their 500. But which citizens? Farmers and merchants taken in raids, valuable to their families but replaceable to Rome. Which 500 do they recover? Trained officers, professional soldiers, men who know our tactics and can train new armies. The mathematical precision of his argument cut through emotional fog. Senators who'd been swayed by sympathy found themselves recalculating, seeing strategic implications they'd missed in humanitarian concern. Peace faction members shifted uncomfortably as their primary argument crumbled under logical assault from the very man it was meant to save. The territorial adjustments seem minor, he continued, pointing to maps displayed for reference. 3 villages, 2 ports, territory barely worth naming. But trace the boundaries carefully. Those villages control water sources for our African settlements. Those ports provide the only reliable harbours for naval operations. Carthage reclaims strategic advantage while seeming to ask for scraps. Young Marcus Cornelius, barely old enough for senatorial rank, stood despite protocol. But surely your freedom matters more than distant territories. Rome has strength to spare, but only one Marcus Atilius Regulus. The outburst earned sharp looks from senior members but voiced what many felt. Regulus turned toward the young senator with something that might have been gentleness on features less damaged. Rome has produced countless Reguluses and will produce countless more, each ready to serve and die for the Republic. But strategic advantages surrendered in momentary weakness last generations. Would you have my name remembered as the price for Carthage's resurrection? The systematic demolition of Carthaginian proposals continued with relentless logic. Trade agreements that seemed equitable would actually restore enemy finances within 5 years. Military restrictions that appeared mutual would hamper Roman flexibility while leaving Carthaginian options open. Every clause had been crafted to seem reasonable while serving long-term enemy interests. Senator Fabius watched his friend destroy any hope of personal salvation with growing horror masked by stoic expression. He'd seen Regulus command armies with this same methodical brilliance, but never imagined that tactical genius turned towards self-destruction. Each argument made rejection more certain, made the speaker's doom more absolute. Even senators who'd initially opposed the terms found themselves wishing Regulus would stop, would leave some room for honourable compromise. The Carthaginian senior diplomat finally stood, abandoning protocol in desperation. This violates the spirit of your oath. You swore to present our terms faithfully. His Latin carried heavy accent but clear meaning, cutting through senatorial murmurs with accusatory force. Regulus faced him directly, chains rattling as he turned. I presented your terms with perfect accuracy. I swore no oath to advocate for them. Roman honour demands truth over personal interest, and I speak truth now. Your terms are poison wrapped in silk, and I will not be the hand that feeds it to Rome. The exchange crystallized the situation for any senators still unclear. Carthage had created the perfect trap, but failed to account for Roman virtue taken to logical extremes. They'd assumed self-interest would motivate their messenger, not understanding they dealt with a man for whom abstract principle had become more real than physical pain. Consider the precedent. Regulus pressed on as the diplomat sank back defeated. If Rome ransoms me through strategic disadvantage, every future enemy will know our weakness. Capture prominent citizens, apply sufficient pressure, and Rome will negotiate against its interests. Better that I die, that Carthage wastes 5 years of investment, that enemies learn Roman citizens cannot be used as leverage. The argument's cold logic made several senators physically ill. They could see wives explaining to children why the Republic had chosen principle over their father's life. They could imagine their own capture, their own families making similar calculations. The personal cost of Roman virtue had never been displayed so starkly. Marcia had entered the gallery during his speech, accompanied by their children. Regulus must have noticed, his rhythm faltering for just a moment before recovering. The sight of his family watching him argue for his own death added another layer of horror to proceedings already steeped in it. Claudia pressed against her mother's side while Marcus Minor stood rigid with growing understanding of what his father was choosing. "Some will say I seek death to escape pain." Regulus acknowledged what everyone thought but none would voice. After 5 years of Carthaginian hospitality, death holds no terror. But understand clearly, I would endure 5 more years, 50 more years, rather than see Rome diminished by my weakness. This is not about my suffering, but about Roman strength maintained for your children and their children after them. The Senate's usual divisions dissolved under the weight of his words. Political enemies found themselves united in desperate desire to find some alternative, some interpretation that would let them save their colleague without betraying principle. The best legal minds in Rome turned toward a problem that had no solution, not when the man they sought to save insisted on his own destruction. "Vote with clear conscience," Regulus concluded, stepping back from the podium with finality that precluded further argument. "Reject Carthaginian terms entirely. Send me back to whatever ingenious torments they devise. Let my death purchase not personal glory, but Roman clarity about the cost of principle. Future generations will face similar choices. Let them know we chose correctly when tested." The formal procedures that followed felt like funeral rites performed for a man still breathing. Speakers rose to address specific points, but everyone understood the outcome had been determined. The vote would be overwhelming rejection, and Regulus would return to Carthage without even the comfort of diplomatic failure. He had personally guaranteed the worst possible result for himself. Senator Fabius made the final attempt, rising with authority earned through decades of service. The Senate can reject these terms while finding alternative solutions. Creative diplomacy might yet secure your freedom without compromising Roman interests. Why insist on this absolute position? Why leave us no room to save you? Regulus answered without returning to the podium, his words carrying clearly through a chamber so quiet that breathing seemed sacrilege. Because Carthage must learn that Roman virtue cannot be used against itself. They calculated that my suffering would motivate your surrender. They must discover instead that Romans choose death before dishonor, that personal interest never outweighs public good. My return and inevitable execution will teach them more about Roman character than any victory in battle. The logic was irrefutable, the conclusion inescapable, the human cost unbearable. Senators who'd entered expecting routine diplomatic negotiation found themselves participating in elaborate suicide, watching a man methodically construct his own doom while they sat powerless to prevent it. The vote, when taken, was unanimous. Rome would continue the war, and Regulus would return to hell. Marcia grabbed the knife from the kitchen shelf, her fingers closing around the worn bone handle with desperate certainty. The blade caught lamplight as she turned toward where Regulus sat with their youngest son, telling stories of campaigns that now seemed like myths from another lifetime. If the Senate wouldn't stop her husband from leaving, if reason had fled before honor's madness, then perhaps maternal fury could succeed where logic failed. The children had been sent to bed 3 times already, but kept creeping back to doorways, drawn by the gravity of impending loss. Their father would sail tomorrow, carrying his own death sentence back to Carthage with the mechanical precision of a man beyond human feeling. Each story he told them rang with finality, memories packaged and delivered like provisions for a journey he wouldn't share. Marcia's hands shook as she set the knife aside, recognizing the futility before acting on desperation. She'd married a Roman consul, understood the weight of honor that pressed down on their class like atmosphere on earth. The blade would never reach its target because Regulus himself would stop her, gently but firmly, explaining again why abstract principle mattered more than breathing children who needed their father. Young Gaius climbed into his father's lap, still small enough to fit despite his 7 years. The boy traced scars on Regulus's arms with curious fingers, each mark a chapter in horror he couldn't comprehend. Tomorrow these arms would be gone forever, but tonight they still held Roman children with careful tenderness that belied the damage carved into flesh. "Tell about the elephants again," Gaius demanded with childhood's appetite for familiar stories. Regulus obliged, his voice steady despite knowing this was the last time these words would pass between them. The war beasts of Carthage trumpeted through their modest home, magnificent in memory, terrible in consequence. Claudia sat at her mother's feet, 15 years of Roman girlhood struggling to understand why duty demanded such sacrifice. She'd prepared a song for her father's return, practiced it through 5 years of absence, perfected every note for this reunion that had become farewell. The melody would remain unsung, another small casualty of honor's arithmetic. Marcus Minor paced the atrium like a caged wolf, his 17-year-old frame taut with anger he couldn't properly direct. His father's arguments in the Senate had spread through Rome like wildfire, each retelling adding to the legend while diminishing the man. Heroes in stories made grand sacrifices and lived forever in memory. Fathers in homes left empty spaces that memory couldn't fill. "You could stay," Marcia said suddenly, words escaping before wisdom could contain them. "Simply don't board the ship. Claim illness, divine intervention, anything. Let Carthage think Rome prevented your return rather than chose it." The suggestion hung between them like incense, sweet with possibility, poisoned by impossibility. Regulus met her gaze with eyes that couldn't blink, couldn't look away, couldn't grant even momentary relief from truth. His voice carried gentleness that made rejection worse than harshness would have been. "And teach our sons that oaths matter only when convenient? Show our daughter that Roman virtue bends under pressure? What inheritance would that leave them?" The weight of his logic crushed hope more thoroughly than any torturer's stones. Marcia understood with clarity that cut deeper than kitchen knives that she'd lost this battle before it began. The man she'd married had been transformed by suffering into something beyond human reach, a principle wrapped in scarred flesh that responded only to duty's call. Gaius had fallen asleep against his father's chest, breathing with the easy rhythm of childhood that trusts tomorrow will resemble today. Regulus held him with infinite care, memorizing weight and warmth, and the particular way his youngest child fit against damaged ribs. These sense memories would be all he carried back to Carthaginian darkness. "Mother tried to hide father once," Marcus Minor announced suddenly, his voice cracking between boy and man. "When I was 12, before the African campaign, she had everything prepared. A villa in the countryside, provisions for months. Father found the plans and burned them himself. The story emerged like accusation, demanding explanation for patterns that repeated despite their cost." Marcia's face flushed at the revealed secret, but Regulus smiled with something approaching warmth. "Your mother has always been the clever one. I merely stumbled forward while she planned 10 moves ahead. But some paths allow no deviation, regardless of superior alternatives waiting in countryside villas." The night advanced with cruel efficiency, each water clock's drip measuring heartbeats that wouldn't be shared again. Servants moved through evening routines with exaggerated quiet, understanding that this wasn't mere departure, but something final wearing departure's mask. Even household slaves who'd barely known the master felt the weight of impending absence. Claudia finally sang her prepared song, voice pure and clear despite tears that threatened each note. The melody spoke of homecoming and joy, of families reunited and peace restored. Every word twisted like bronze chains, beautiful and binding, as present reality made mockery of innocent hope. Regulus listened without movement, absorbing his daughter's gift like wine poured on desert sand. "Will they hurt you very badly?" Gaius asked with sleepy directness, woken by his sister's singing. The question froze everyone in place, the child voicing what adults danced around with elaborate courtesy. Marcia reached for her son, but stopped at Regulus's slight gesture. "Yes," he answered simply, granting truth the respect his youngest deserved. "But pain ends. What we choose echoes forever. Someday, you'll understand why temporary suffering matters less than permanent example." The philosophy meant nothing to 7-year-old comprehension, but the tone conveyed everything necessary. Marcus Minor's control finally shattered, years of suppressed emotion erupting in words that rang off stone walls. "Then you're a fool, a prideful, stubborn fool who values Roman approval over your own family. What good is honor to orphans? What comfort will principle provide when we wake tomorrow knowing you chose death over us?" The accusation hung in sudden silence, even household sounds pausing at the young man's audacity. Marcia reached for her eldest but found only empty air as he stormed from the room. His footsteps echoed through the house, followed by the slam of a distant door that sounded like endings given physical form. Regulus made no move to follow, understanding that some truths required distance before acceptance. His remaining time could be spent chasing reconciliation or creating final memories with those who remained. The choice, like all choices now, had been made before consideration began. "He'll understand eventually," Claudia said with wisdom beyond her years, filling space her brother had left vacant. "When he has children of his own, when he faces his own tests, he'll know why you couldn't choose differently. We all will." The words came out rehearsed, repeated comfort she'd been telling herself since Senate vote made outcomes certain. Marcia gathered Gaius from his father's arms, the boy protesting sleepily at disruption. This time, bedtime would be enforced, privacy granted for final conversations that required adult understanding. Claudia followed without prompting, pausing at the doorway to look back at parents who stood like statues carved from different stone but sharing single purpose. Alone at last, Marcia's composure cracked like pottery under pressure. The tears came silently, Roman dignity maintained even in extremity, while her hands clutched at his tunic with desperate strength. He held her carefully, damaged body trying to provide comfort it could barely contain, while she shook with suppressed sobs that threatened to wake children who needed what sleep remained. "I could come with you," she whispered against his chest, words muffled by fabric and grief. "Take the children, establish household in Carthage. They might allow it, seeing profit in keeping their hostage content. We could be together even if—" The suggestion died unfinished, impossibility acknowledged before hope could take root. Regulus stroked her hair with fingers that remembered gentleness despite years of contradiction. "You know they'd use you all against me. Every cry from the children would be weapon in their hands. Better you remain here, strong and Roman, showing them how to endure with dignity. Logic cold as winter mornings, necessary as breathing, cruel as honor itself." Footsteps in the atrium announced Marcus Minor's return, his rage spent enough to permit proximity. He stood in the doorway watching his parents embrace, understanding finally beginning to dawn. This was what it meant to be Roman aristocracy, to carry burden of example that crushed individual desire beneath collective need. "I'm sorry," the young man managed, words rough with emotion. "I know you have no choice. I just wish the choice didn't exist, that we lived in a world where fathers could simply be fathers without the weight of history demanding sacrifice." The apology carried maturity forced by circumstance, childhood's end marked by acceptance of unacceptable realities. Regulus released Marcia to embrace his eldest son, the gesture awkward with damaged limbs but fierce with paternal love. They stood that way while water clocks measured moments that fled too quickly, three Romans understanding duty while desperately wishing understanding could be avoided. "Promise me," Marcia said suddenly, her voice carrying steel that had supported household through 5 years of absence. "Promise that when it happens, you'll think of us as we are tonight, not with sorrow for what's lost, but gratitude for what was shared. Let that be your final victory over them." The oath she requested was harder than any Carthage had demanded. To die thinking of joy rather than pain, to hold love in a heart that would know only agony, to make memory shield against present horror. Regulus nodded slowly, adding this promise to the collection that bound his path with inevitable direction. Dawn approached with unwelcome punctuality, sky lightening despite prayers for extended darkness. The Carthaginian escort would arrive soon. Bronze chains would replace tonight's temporary freedom, and the march to harbour would begin. Time for preparation had expired, leaving only execution of plans made in Senate chambers and sealed with Roman virtue. Marcia organized the household with desperate efficiency, ensuring every detail was addressed before absence made address impossible. Instructions for children's tutors, provisions for household management, letters to family members who would need to know. Each task completed brought departure closer while providing structure against chaos that threatened to overwhelm. The children woke without summons, drawn by instinct to gather in the atrium where their father waited. Even Gaius seemed to understand this morning was different, his usual chatter subdued to whispers. They arranged themselves like portrait subjects, creating memory that would have to last lifetimes. Regulus spoke to each child individually, words chosen with care of a man who understood he'd never have chance for clarification. To Claudia, praise for her strength and reminder that Roman women shaped the Republic as surely as men who claimed credit. To Marcus Minor, forgiveness for anger and confidence in the leader he would become. To Gaius, simple truths about courage and conviction, wrapped in stories he could understand. The sound of approaching footsteps ended private farewells. Carthaginian guards appeared in the doorway, their presence transforming home into stage for public performance. Bronze chains waited in their hands, ready to resume burden temporarily lifted. The pretense of diplomacy fell away, revealing truth that had always lurked beneath surface. Marcia stepped forward before they could enter, her bearing forcing acknowledgement of Roman matron's authority within her own domain. You will wait in the street while my husband prepares himself. He will emerge when ready, not before. This is Rome, not Carthage, and you will observe proper courtesy. The guards exchanged glances but withdrew, understanding that small victories in meaningless battles might be all dignity allowed. Marcia turned back to her family, granting them moments stolen from inevitability. Each heartbeat became precious, hoarded against future poverty of absence. Regulus dressed carefully in his finest toga, each fold arranged with precision that spoke of Roman order maintained despite chaos. His children helped, small hands adjusting fabric while memorizing texture and warmth. Marcia fastened the clasp at his shoulder, fingers lingering on metal that would outlast flesh. "Remember us," she whispered, fierce command disguised as plea. "When darkness comes, when pain threatens to erase everything else, remember this morning. Remember that you were loved. Remember that your sacrifice had meaning. Remember that Rome endures because men like you choose duty over ease." He kissed her forehead with infinite gentleness, then each child in turn. No more words remained. Everything essential had been spoken or understood in silence. The time for delay had ended, and Marcus Atilius Regulus would keep his appointments with both honour and agony. The door opened onto street filled with citizens who'd gathered to witness tragedy dressed as duty. Some wept openly, others stood in stoic silence, all understanding they watched something that would echo through generations. Carthaginian guards waited with professional patience, chains ready to resume their burden. Regulus stepped across his threshold for the last time, children clinging until Marcia gently pulled them back. The bronze chains locked around wrists that had held babies and commanded armies with equal authority. Each click of metal against metal sounded like fate sealing itself against appeal. The procession began its march toward harbour, where ships waited to carry principle back to punishment. Citizens followed at respectful distance, witnesses to choice that would define Roman virtue for centuries. Some threw flowers that landed at his feet, small gestures of support that changed nothing while meaning everything. Claudia broke free from her mother's grip, running after the procession with desperate speed. Guards moved to intercept, but Regulus stopped them with a gesture. His daughter reached him breathless, pressing something small into his chained hands before guards could interfere. A wooden toy soldier, carved years ago by father for daughter, worn smooth by countless games of military glory. She retreated without words, understanding passing between them that transcended language. The toy disappeared into his toga's folds, talisman against darkness that approached with every step. Marcia stood in their doorway holding their sons, watching until distance swallowed detail. Her face showed nothing that crowd could read, dignity maintained like armor against unbearable loss. Only when the last citizen had passed did she allow herself to speak, words meant for children but carrying weight of prophecy. "Your father goes to teach Carthage a lesson about Roman character. They think they've won by forcing impossible choices. They'll learn instead that Romans make impossible choices routine, that we are strongest when tested beyond endurance. His death will purchase more than any victory in battle." Marcus Minor placed his hand on his mother's shoulder, understanding finally complete. Tomorrow would bring grief and adjustment to absence that would never heal. But today they had witnessed something greater than personal tragedy. They had seen virtue choose its own destruction rather than compromise, principle elevated above flesh, duty triumphant over desire. As his ship disappeared beyond the horizon, Marcia swore an oath of her own, one that would horrify even hardened soldiers. The Carthaginian envoys couldn't believe it. Their prisoner was actually coming back to die. Rigging sang in the steady wind, lines humming like taut bowstrings as the hull pressed through dark water. Regulus stood near the mast and let the sea speak to him. Slap against planks, hiss along the keel, the low groan of timber drawing breath. 3 guards watched him without swagger, eyes sliding from the raw rims of his unblinking gaze to the small lump beneath his toga, where a child's toy waited like a heartbeat. One of them muttered that no man in his right mind walks back into pain when a ship points home and the wind fills every sail toward freedom. Night wrapped the deck in damp air and quiet footfalls. The lantern swung and ticked against its hook, throwing a slow arc of light that kept time with the hull. He whispered, with no one and with everything, counting breaths, clenching and releasing his fingers until pain slid like a blade into its sheath for a while. Respect crept in where contempt had lived. The envoys shared their water and stopped calling him hostage when the crew could hear them. Even his guards whispered escape plans in the night. One described a fishing cove up the coast, where a friend would hide a skiff behind reeds. Another offered a knife wrapped in cloth so the metal would not knock against wood and give him away. A third sketched the guard rotations at the gangway with a bit of charcoal on sailcloth, voice dropping when the lantern hissed in a sudden gust. Regulus listened, thanked each man, and refused in a tone that carried neither pride nor plea, only decision. He promised them he would step into the pit so they could crawl out later. The ship creaked like an old soldier shifting armor as the swell lifted. Salt burned his unshaded eyes, but he welcomed the sting because it taught his nerves to obey him. He rehearsed pain the way he used to rehearse deployments. Count the interval, master the breath, ride the rhythm, hold the center. Ropes knocked the mast in a steady clack that sounded like a metronome for suffering yet to come, and he timed his heartbeat to it. The closer they got to Carthage, the more elaborate the execution plans became. The envoys huddled at the stern and sent a courier ahead on a fast hull when the wind shifted in their favor. They spoke names of craftsmen who measured agony for a living, and argued over whose design would shame Rome most convincingly. Regulus drank the words like he drank seawater fumes, not because he wanted them, but because he needed to know their taste. A grey-bearded envoy approached, cleared his throat, and told him of an old Carthaginian captain who chose to drown rather than surrender his crew. The story offered like a bridge across rage. Regulus answered with a Roman story of keeping faith when faith cut the hands that held it, and the deck fell still. Below deck, other Romans lay cramped in the hold, chains scuffing wood with every small adjustment. A centurion he knew by voice, not face, hissed a plea through the slats to cut the lashings and run when darkness pressed hardest. Regulus touched the little wooden soldier in his tunic and felt the grooves where a child's thumb had worn them smooth. He told the centurion to live instead, to take the first trading vessel out when the exchange freed lesser captives, to carry a message home that did not soften what duty demanded. When he finished, the slats stayed quiet, except for the slow rasp of a man who chose breathing over impulse. A squall shouldered the ship before dawn, hard rain thudding on deck like 1,000 drummers. Sails cracked like whips. Men shouted into the wind. The mast sang a deeper note as the hull climbed and dropped. Regulus planted his feet and leaned into the motion, letting the storm pound everything loose that pity still tried to claim. By morning the sea flattened to a pewter calm, and gulls screeched over the wake like critics who enjoyed the performance but despised the plot. When the squall passed, the crew looked at him, as if he had stood through more than wind. The days shortened as they turned south, and the sun slid low with a furnace glow. He trained his mind to walk toward heat instead of away from it, to ride the pain's edge and never give it the satisfaction of a flinch. The envoys stopped testing him with offers and started speaking to him like a colleague, on a mission everyone understood, but no one loved. One brought dates and a small cup of thick wine. Another rehearsed the formalities of arrival. A third, youngest of them, simply sat and listened to the sea with him. He asked the gods for one small mercy that would leave no mark but change everything. At last the pilot boat scraped alongside and men hauled lines with a chorus of grunts that carried authority. Voices rolled from the shore like distant thunder, a low human tide that warned him the city had prepared not just a ceremony, but a verdict. Hammer blows rose over the water, metal ringing on metal with the clipped tempo of craftsmen who followed drawings, not inspiration. The wind carried smells of cedar and hot resin, and a sweeter scent he could not place until he felt his stomach tighten at the memory of fire warming oil. When the harbour came into view, Regulus could see them constructing something mechanical, something purposeful. They showed him the spiked box first, letting him count each needle-sharp point before shoving him inside. The Carthaginian craftsmen had spent 3 days perfecting their creation, not some crude cage thrown together in anger, but a precisely engineered instrument where mathematics married suffering. The box stood upright like a standing coffin, its interior walls bristling with iron spikes, each measured to penetrate exactly half an inch into flesh. Deep enough to create constant agony, shallow enough to avoid vital organs that might grant the mercy of quick death. The Egyptian master torturer ran his fingers along the spikes with professional appreciation, explaining to his assistants how the human body would instinctively try to find a position of minimal contact. But the box's dimensions had been calculated to make such relief impossible. Any movement to ease pressure on one set of wounds would drive other spikes deeper. The victim would exhaust himself seeking comfort that the geometry specifically denied. Regulus studied the device with the same detachment he'd once applied to siege engines. The wood was quality cedar, expensive enough to show respect for his rank. The spikes gleamed with fresh oil that would prevent rust while ensuring smooth penetration. Even the hinges had been crafted by metal workers who understood that squeaking would diminish the psychological impact of slow, inevitable closure. They stripped him with ceremonial precision, 2 guards holding his arms while others removed the tattered remains of his toga. The Egyptian noted each scar from previous sessions, occasionally touching an old wound with scholarly interest. His assistant recorded observations on wax tablets, building knowledge that would guide future applications of calculated cruelty. The crowd outside pressed against barriers, their murmuring creating vibrations that travelled through stone floors. Every instinct told Regulus to resist as they positioned him before the open box, but training and discipline ran deeper than fear. He stepped forward without prompting, denying them the satisfaction of forcing him. The first contact brought sharp intakes of breath from watching guards who understood what those precisely placed points would soon accomplish. The spikes pressed against his back first, each one finding its designated spot with mechanical certainty. The Egyptian made minor adjustments, ensuring optimal distribution of contact points. This wasn't random perforation, but orchestrated penetration designed to activate specific nerve clusters. The craftsmanship showed in how quickly Regulus's breathing changed, becoming shallow and rapid as his body processed the initial violations. They closed the front panel slowly, savouring the moment when spikes met flesh from the opposite direction. The Roman's jaw clenched, but no sound escaped. Not yet. The box's designer had anticipated such stoicism, building in features that would erode control over time. The floor tilted slightly forward, forcing weight onto the frontal spikes. Ankle restraints prevented the natural compensation of bending knees. Time inside the box moved differently than time outside. Each heartbeat drove blood pressure changes that made the wounds pulse with fresh agony. Every breath expanded the chest into waiting points. The Egyptian had calculated that most men would begin vocalizing within 10 minutes, progressing from controlled breathing to gasps to eventual screaming. He settled onto a bench to observe, stylus ready to record variations. Regulus discovered what the designer intended within moments. The human body's need for movement, usually unconscious, became conscious torture. Muscles demanded adjustment, position changes that would normally happen without thought. But here, every micro-movement brought punishment. The urge to shift weight from left foot to right became overwhelming, but yielding meant driving hip and shoulder into new configurations of pain. Sweat began immediately, the body's attempt to cool itself under stress. But moisture made the wounds burn differently, salt finding each tiny perforation with chemical precision. Drops rolled down his sides, each one marking a pathway of fresh discomfort. The Egyptian noted the speed of perspiration onset, comparing it against previous subjects with professional interest. The breathing exercises Regulus had practiced during the sea voyage served him now. He found a rhythm that minimized chest expansion while maintaining sufficient oxygen. But the box's designer had anticipated this too. The spikes were arranged to make any sustainable breathing pattern gradually more difficult. What worked for the first few minutes would fail as muscles tired and positions shifted involuntarily. Guards placed bets on how long the Roman would maintain silence. Veterans of previous sessions offered odds based on experience, though several noted this subject seemed different. Where others had fought against the box with desperate energy that hastened their deterioration, Regulus remained motionless, except for necessary breathing. The stillness itself became another form of torture, as muscles cramped from maintaining unnatural positions. Every instinct to shift position brought new agony. The box had been built to exploit human nature's most basic programming: the need to redistribute weight from tired muscles, the urge to scratch sudden itches, the desire to stretch cramping limbs. Each natural impulse became a trap that drove iron deeper into already screaming flesh. The Egyptian stood to examine his subject more closely, noting the peculiar patterns of blood flow. Where most victims created random wound patterns through thrashing, Regulus's stillness produced methodical perforations that followed the designer's exact intentions. Each spike performed its designated function without interference from panic. The torturer made notes about this unexpected validation of theoretical placement. Sound became Regulus's primary focus as other senses overwhelmed with input. He listened to the crowd's distant roar, the scratch of stylus on tablet, the breathing of guards who watched with mixed fascination and revulsion. These external noises provided anchors to reality as internal sensation threatened to consume all awareness. He counted heartbeats between crowd surges, finding patterns that suggested organized chanting rather than random noise. The first involuntary vocalization came after 20 minutes, by the water clock's measurement. Not a scream, but a sharp exhalation as a particularly severe cramp forced movement that drove shoulder spikes deeper than sustainability allowed. The Egyptian nodded satisfaction at this breach in control, understanding it marked a transition point. Once the body began responding despite will's commands, deterioration accelerated predictably. Blood flow patterns told their own story. The designer had ensured no single wound would bleed dangerously, but the cumulative effect created steady loss that would weaken without killing. Regulus felt the drain as subtle lightheadedness that made maintaining position even harder. His legs trembled with effort, each shake driving new points home. The Egyptian's assistant suggested extraction after the first hour, concerned about permanent damage that might interfere with planned future sessions. His master disagreed, recognizing they dealt with unusual material that could withstand greater testing. The investment in keeping this particular Roman functional for maximum propaganda value had been discussed at highest levels. Today's session would push boundaries without crossing them. Time became meaningless when every second lasted an eternity. Regulus lost track of duration, aware only that suffering continued without variation or relief. The box performed exactly as designed, making endurance a greater torture than surrender would have been. Men who broke quickly at least escaped into unconsciousness or madness. Those who endured experienced every calculated moment of the designer's intentions. The crowd's noise changed quality, suggesting new entertainment beginning elsewhere. The Egyptian recognized the shift and signaled his assistance. They'd achieved the session's goals, creating specific trauma that would linger without incapacitating. The knowledge gained would refine future applications, but more importantly, the Roman would carry this experience into whatever came next. Opening the box required the same deliberation as closing it had. Spikes withdrew from wounds they'd created, each extraction bringing fresh varieties of pain. Regulus's legs failed immediately, muscles pushed beyond endurance, refusing commands. Guards caught him with practiced efficiency, their handling showing experience with victims in various states of physical collapse. They laid him on a stone platform where the Egyptian conducted post-session examination. Each wound was catalogued, its depth and position recorded for future reference. The torturer expressed professional satisfaction at the uniform penetration patterns, evidence that his theoretical calculations matched practical application. His assistant applied minimal treatment, enough to prevent infection without easing discomfort. Recovery meant returning to the standard cell, where darkness pressed against damaged eyes, and memories of the box created phantom pains in wounds that continued weeping. Regulus understood this was merely preparation, that worse waited in whatever timetable his captors followed. The box had been introduction, not climax. When guards arrived the next morning, they found him in the same position they'd left him, conserving energy with stillness that unnerved even veterans of this duty. The Egyptian arrived to inspect yesterday's work, pleased to find inflammation proceeding exactly as predicted. He informed Regulus that today would explore different possibilities, that variety in suffering prevented accommodation that might diminish impact. They showed him the next device with the same ceremonial revelation, a frame that would stretch joints past design limits without quite dislocating them. Again, the craftsmanship showed in every detail, from padded restraints that prevented circulation loss to carefully calibrated tension mechanisms. The builder had studied human anatomy with medical precision, understanding exactly how far tendons could stretch before snapping. The session proceeded with mechanical efficiency. They positioned him according to diagrams, adjusted tensions to prescribed specifications, then observed results with scholarly detachment. Where the box had created numerous small agonies, this device focused on specific large ones. Shoulders rotated past comfort, past pain, to the edge where ligaments began tearing but hadn't yet separated. The Egyptian explained the theory while his subject experienced the practice. Joint manipulation required understanding of individual variation. What merely hurt one man might cripple another. The art lay in finding each subject's particular limits, then maintaining position just short of permanent damage. His fingers tested resistance with surgeon sensitivity, adjusting mechanisms when he detected approaching failure points. Hours passed in this careful orchestration of suffering. Where crude torturers would simply wrench until something broke, the Egyptian's approach created sustainable agony. Regulus existed in space between endurable and unbearable, where the body's protective mechanisms engaged but couldn't provide relief. Every nerve screamed warnings about damage occurring, damage continuing, damage threatening to become permanent. The crowd outside had grown larger, drawn by rumors of the Roman who wouldn't break. Carthaginian nobles paid premium prices for viewing positions where they could watch the Egyptian work. Some came for vengeance, remembering losses to Roman legions. Others displayed scholarly interest in techniques that might prove useful in their own domains. All left impressed by both the torturer's skill and the subject's unnatural endurance. Between sessions, they allowed minimal recovery. Food appeared irregularly, sometimes adequate, sometimes deliberately fouled. Water came when dehydration threatened consciousness, but before it granted relief. The calculation showed in every detail, maintaining their investment while maximizing its suffering. The Egyptian reviewed each day's notes, refining approaches based on observed responses. The fifth day brought innovation. Rather than introducing new devices, the Egyptian combined previous methods. The box's spikes had left a map of wounds across Regulus's body. Now he applied specific pressure to these healing punctures, reactivating pain pathways that had begun accommodating. The technique required delicate touch. Too much pressure would create new wounds that might heal differently. Too little would fail to achieve desired neural response. Regulus discovered that familiar pain returning felt worse than new varieties. His body had begun incorporating the spike wounds into its adjusted baseline. Having them individually reawakened created disorientation that mental preparation couldn't address. The Egyptian noted this response with satisfaction, adding observations about psychological impact to his growing manuscript on sustainable torture methodology. Physical degradation proceeded in measured stages, weight loss carefully monitored to prevent dangerous weakness. Muscle atrophy allowed within limits that preserved mobility. The systematic destruction of a human body, while maintaining its functionality, required constant calibration. Too much damage would end the performance prematurely. Too little would fail to achieve desired propaganda effects. Sleep deprivation added another layer to the program. Not complete prevention, which would lead to rapid psychosis, but carefully interrupted rest that prevented real recovery. Guards worked shifts, ensuring no sleep cycle lasted long enough for deep restoration. The cumulative effect compounded physical torture with mental exhaustion that made resistance increasingly difficult. Yet Regulus endured with consistency that frustrated and impressed his tormentors. Where other subjects had broken down into begging or bargaining or simple screaming, he maintained a reserve that seemed to exist beyond their reach. The Egyptian theorized about Roman conditioning, about cultural factors that created such abnormal pain tolerance. His notes grew increasingly detailed as he attempted to understand this outlier in his careful data. The 10th day brought visitors, Carthaginian officials who needed to assess their investment's condition. They toured the torture chamber like merchants inspecting goods, asking technical questions about sustainability and timeline. The Egyptian assured them his subject could endure weeks more of current treatment, months if they accepted gradually diminishing returns. One official, elderly and bearing scars from Roman weapons, studied Regulus with particular interest. He asked whether the prisoner ever spoke, ever revealed anything useful about Roman plans or dispositions. The Egyptian admitted his subject remained remarkably uncommunicative, beyond involuntary vocalizations of pain. Even delirium brought no useful intelligence, only references to abstract concepts of duty and honor. This troubled the officials more than resistance would have. A man who broke could be controlled through his breaking. One who endured without breaking became dangerous in different ways. They conferred quietly about acceleration versus sustainability, weighing propaganda value against risk of creating martyrdom. The Egyptian counseled patience, arguing that everyone broke eventually, that his methods simply required time to erode even abnormal resistance. New implements arrived over following days, not crude tools of immediate damage but sophisticated devices that attacked specific vulnerabilities. A helmet that created precise pressure on skull sutures, needles designed to stimulate nerve clusters without lasting damage, chemical compounds that enhance sensitivity to other stimuli, each innovation carefully tested and calibrated for maximum sustainable effect. The Egyptian's assistant worried about approaching some undefined limit. He'd seen subjects reach points where continued torture produced diminishing returns, where the body's adaptive mechanisms began defeating their purposes. His master dismissed these concerns, confident that proper technique could extend suffering indefinitely. The Romans simply required more creative approaches than typical subjects. Regulus felt his world contracting to awareness of immediate sensation and necessary response. Past and future lost meaning when present consumed all available processing. He maintained sanity through focus on fragments, the toy soldier's weight against his chest, memorized faces of children, the specific quality of Mediterranean light on morning water. These anchors held against tide of agony that sought to wash away everything except itself. The 15th day brought unexpected change. Guards arrived with different energy, urgency replacing routine. They extracted him from standard restraints, with haste that suggested new timeline. The Egyptian protested this disruption of his careful schedule, but higher authorities had made decisions. Whatever came next would follow different patterns than the methodical exploration of sustainable suffering. They dragged him through corridors towards sounds of greater activity. Hammering echoed from spaces ahead, mixed with shouts of workers following urgent instructions. The quality of light changed as they emerged into larger chamber where something massive took shape. Regulus forced damaged eyes to focus, understanding that his captors had decided on acceleration rather than sustainability. When they finally dragged him out, Regulus thought it was over. Then he saw the oil beginning to bubble. The execution engineer had spent weeks perfecting the mechanism. Bronze gears meshed with mathematical precision, each tooth filed smooth to ensure no stuttering that might grant accidental mercy. The pulleys bore silk ropes rather than hemp, their surfaces waxed to eliminate friction that could interfere with the controlled descent. Every component served a single purpose, transforming a swift death into an extended performance. Carthaginian metalworkers had competed for the honor of contributing to this device. The frame rose 20 feet, crafted from Lebanese cedar that would neither warp in heat nor crack under strain. Iron reinforcements at stress points had been forged 7 times, cooled in sacred water, blessed by priests who understood that divine sanction mattered as much as engineering excellence. The platform where Regulus would stand featured trapdoors that could open in stages, lowering him inch by calculated inch. The cauldron itself represented months of specialized labor. Not some repurposed cooking vessel, but a purpose-built chamber of suffering. Its walls tapered inward to concentrate heat while preventing splashing that might end things prematurely. The copper interior had been polished to mirror brightness, partly for heat conduction but mostly so the victim could watch his own reflection distort as he descended. Measurement marks etched inside would let observers track exact progress. Oil selection had consumed weeks of debate among experts. Olive oil burned too quickly, created too much smoke. Animal fats congealed unpredictably. The final mixture combined imported petroleum with local plant extracts, creating a substance that maintained consistent temperature while producing minimal vapor. Test runs with animal carcasses had refined the formula until it delivered exactly what the engineer promised: heat that destroyed slowly without the mercy of rapid immolation. The surrounding amphitheater had been modified to accommodate maximum witnesses. Stone tiers rose in concentric circles, each level calculated for optimal viewing angles. The engineer had insisted on acoustic considerations, designing the space to amplify certain frequencies while dampening others. Screams would carry clearly to the furthest seats. The bubbling oil would provide constant undertone. The mechanical sounds of the lowering mechanism would punctuate the performance with rhythmic certainty. Citizens began gathering before dawn, their footsteps on stone creating a low rumble that built as daylight strengthened. Veterans of previous executions claimed premium positions, understanding from experience where sight lines and sound quality intersected optimally. Vendors worked the crowds, selling cushions for long sitting, sweet wine to combat the expected smells, written accounts of Regulus's crimes against Carthage for those who needed reminders of why this was justified. The engineer supervised final preparations with an artist's attention to detail. He tested each rope's tension personally, ran his hands along pulley grooves feeling for imperfections. His assistants had learned not to question when he demanded minute adjustments that seemed meaningless. The difference between a smooth descent and a jerky one might be imperceptible during testing but would matter enormously during performance. Noble families arrived in coordinated groups, their purple-trimmed robes marking status and reserved seating. Many had lost sons or brothers to Roman legions during the siege years. They came dressed for celebration, jewels glinting in morning sun, perfumed heavily against anticipated odors. Servants preceded them with parasols and refreshments, preparing for an extended viewing that would require comfort amenities. Children perched on shoulders throughout the crowd, their parents explaining this was history they'd tell their own offspring someday. The youngest didn't understand the explanations, but they absorbed the atmosphere of anticipation mixed with righteous anger. Songs began spontaneously in different sections, Carthaginian victory hymns that hadn't been heard since before the siege. The engineer smiled at this addition to his acoustic planning. The oil heated slowly in its copper prison. Assistants monitored temperature with long bronze rods, comparing readings against predetermined marks. Too hot, and the spectacle would end quickly in conflagration. Too cool, and the effect would be merely painful rather than transcendent. The engineer had calculated thermal dynamics accounting for crowd body heat, time of day, wind patterns. His reputation depended on precision that went beyond mere mechanical function. Priests arrived in ceremonial procession, their movements choreographed to build spiritual weight. They circled the cauldron 3 times, sprinkling sacred oils that hissed on contact with heated metal. Prayers to Baal and Tanit sanctified the coming sacrifice, transforming execution into religious offering. The crowd responded with ritual phrases at appropriate moments, their voices joining in ancient harmonies that predated Rome itself. The engineer checked his water clock one final time. Every aspect of timing had been rehearsed, from the prisoner's arrival to the mechanism's activation to the calculated duration of descent. He'd built in contingencies for various forms of resistance, ways to proceed whether the Roman came willingly or required force. The device itself didn't care about cooperation. Once engaged, it would complete its function with mechanical indifference. Musicians took positions on a specially constructed platform where their instruments wouldn't be overwhelmed by crowd noise. They'd been given specific instructions about when to play, when to fall silent, how to complement rather than compete with the execution's natural sounds. The engineer understood that proper soundtrack enhanced any performance, turning mere event into memorable experience. Guards cleared a pathway from the prison complex to the execution ground. They pushed back eager citizens who pressed too close, establishing a corridor through which the condemned would pass. The engineer wanted everyone to see Regulus clearly during this final journey, to witness what 5 years of Carthaginian justice had left of their tormentor. The visual impact would prepare them for what came next. Rumors rippled through the assembly about the Roman's condition. Some claimed he'd been broken completely, would arrive carried like baggage. Others insisted he maintained unnatural dignity despite everything done to him. The engineer cared less about his subject's mental state than physical capability. The mechanism required someone who could stand initially, though not necessarily for long. Beyond that, gravity and time would handle requirements. The smell of heating oil began permeating the space, an oily sweetness that would soon be joined by other aromas. Experienced viewers positioned themselves upwind, while novices learned why veterans had chosen their spots so carefully. The engineer had considered installing ventilation systems, but decided authentic atmosphere enhanced the experience. Discomfort was part of the lesson being taught. A horn blast signaled movement at the prison gates. The crowd's energy shifted from anticipation to active engagement, necks craning to catch first glimpse of their special guest. The engineer made final adjustments to his position where he could monitor both mechanism and crowd reaction. His assistants stood ready at their stations, hands on controls that would initiate the carefully planned sequence. The procession emerged with deliberate pacing. Guards flanked a figure that moved under its own power, but showed clear evidence of professional attention. The crowd's initial roar fractured into complex reactions as they processed what they saw. Some cheered at visible proof of suffering inflicted. Others fell silent at the systematic nature of damage displayed. All understood they witnessed something beyond normal execution preparation. Regulus walked with mechanical precision that suggested will overriding body's protests. Each step appeared calculated to conserve energy for whatever came next. His eyes, those lidless horrors that had become legendary among the torturers, fixed straight ahead without acknowledging the masses who'd come to watch him die. The wooden soldier tucked in his belt seemed incongruous, a child's toy carried to an adult's ending. The engineer observed his subject's physical condition with professional assessment. The muscle wasting would affect weight calculations, but not significantly. The obvious joint damage might complicate positioning, but wouldn't prevent it. The systematic scarring told its own story of professional attention that had preserved function while maximizing suffering. Whoever had handled preliminary work understood their craft. Citizens who'd paid for premium viewing pressed against barriers as the procession passed. Some spat with practiced accuracy. Others threw refuse that guards deflected with shields. The noise built in waves, each section adding its voice as Regulus passed. Through it all, he maintained the same steady pace, neither hurrying toward his fate nor delaying its arrival. The amphitheater entrance loomed like a mouth preparing to swallow. Inside, the full scope of the engineer's creation would be revealed. The crowd's energy reached crescendo as their special guest approached the threshold. Everything had been building toward this moment when Roman stubbornness would meet Carthaginian innovation. The engineer touched the control rope, feeling its readiness to begin the performance. As they positioned him over the cauldron, Regulus spoke 5 words that would haunt Carthage forever. The ropes creaked against their pulleys with rhythmic precision, each groan marking another calculated inch of descent. Regulus hung suspended in the wooden frame, arms stretched wide by bronze chains that had worn grooves in his wrists over the past 5 years. The oil below moved with lazy malevolence, its surface breaking occasionally in slow bubbles that released vapors thick enough to taste. His lidless eyes tracked the crowd's faces, Carthaginian nobles in their purple-trimmed robes, leaning forward from raised platforms, common citizens packed shoulder to shoulder in the stone tiers. The mechanical perfection of his lowering made the scene feel less like execution and more like sacrifice to gods who demanded their offerings delivered with artisanal care. The engineer checked his water clock again, comparing the descent rate against his calculations while assistants monitored oil temperature with long bronze rods. Everything proceeded exactly as designed, the victim's weight causing the silk ropes to stretch just enough to create the slowest possible journey toward the bubbling surface. Regulus felt the heat rising in waves, each one stronger than the last, his scarred skin beginning to redden from proximity alone. The crowd's murmuring grew louder as his feet approached the oil's surface, close enough now that vapor condensed on his skin in tiny droplets that burned before evaporating. Children watched from their father's shoulders, too young to understand, but old enough to remember the strange quiet that had fallen over the Roman as the mechanism engaged. Where they'd expected begging or cursing, or at least the animal sounds of fear, Regulus had offered only 5 words in a voice that carried across the amphitheatre with unnatural clarity. "Your names will be forgotten." The phrase hung in the air like smoke, its meaning debated in whispers that spread through the crowd, even as the execution proceeded. Some thought it meant the witnesses, others the engineers, still others wondered if he spoke to Carthage itself. The first contact came as his toes broke the oil's surface, the liquid parting with a sound like silk tearing. The heat hit harder than the Egyptians' worst innovations, a pure sensation that bypassed thought entirely. His body jerked involuntarily, the first uncontrolled movement in hours of preparation. But the frame held him steady as the mechanism continued its inexorable function. Steam rose where skin met oil, creating a localized cloud that partially obscured the precise moment when feet became fully submerged. The engineer nodded satisfaction at his calculations, proving correct, the rate of descent matching his theoretical models with gratifying accuracy. The crowd's energy shifted as real suffering began, their bloodlust mixing with something more complex when Regulus maintained his silence despite obvious agony. His jaw clenched tight enough that tendons stood out like rope in his neck, but no scream emerged to satisfy their expectations. The oil crept up his ankles with mechanical patience, each finger's width of progress marking territory that would never recover. Some spectators began wagering on when he'd break, passing coins between themselves while keeping eyes fixed on the central performance. Others found themselves oddly disturbed by the dignity maintained even as flesh began its transformation. Minutes stretched like hours as the oil claimed his calves, the mechanism pausing occasionally as operators adjusted tensions to maintain perfect speed. The heat had moved beyond mere burning into something that defied adequate description, a consumption that operated at levels where words failed. Regulus's breathing came in controlled gasps that misted in the heated air above the cauldron, his body's attempt to manage the unmanageable. The wooden soldier tucked in his belt had begun to char from proximity to rising vapors, its painted features bubbling and distorting like a tiny preview of larger transformations occurring below. A woman in the crowd fainted when the oil reached his knees, the smell finally overwhelming her expensive perfumes. Her servants carried her out while others pressed forward to claim her vacated spot, unwilling to miss history being made with such deliberate artistry. The musicians had fallen silent as ordered, understanding that no composition could compete with the natural sounds of the performance. Only the bubbling oil, the creaking ropes, and the crowd's collective breathing provided soundtrack to systematic destruction. The engineer's assistant whispered concerns about the victim's continued silence, wondering if shock had set in prematurely. His master dismissed such worries, recognizing that consciousness remained evident in how Regulus's hands clenched and unclenched with each wave of ascending heat. Whatever internal reserves the Roman accessed went beyond normal human endurance, but they wouldn't last indefinitely. The oil had claimed his thighs now, the wooden frame beginning to smoke where droplets splashed against it during the occasional bubbles burst. Noble families in the premium sections had grown quiet, their earlier celebration muted by the reality of watching a man slowly consumed while maintaining composure that seemed to judge them rather than beg for mercy. Several turned away despite having paid substantial sums for their positions, finding the actual event different from their anticipation. The engineer noted this reaction with professional interest, understanding that true artistry sometimes disturbed even those who'd commissioned it. The oil reached his waist as the sun climbed toward its zenith, the timing perfect for maximum crowd attendance. Street vendors had run out of wine as viewers sought to wet throats made dry by tension and heat. Regulus's upper body remained untouched, except for the rising temperature that had turned his skin an angry red, sweat streaming from pores in futile attempt to cool what couldn't be cooled. His eyes never closed because they couldn't, forcing him to watch his own reflection in the copper walls as everything below his chest disappeared into roiling destruction. A Carthaginian general who'd lost 2 sons at Tunis stood and walked out when the oil reached Regulus's chest, his departure causing ripples of discussion among those who remained. The Romans' continued silence had transformed from stubbornness into something more unsettling, a judgment delivered without words that made witnesses question their presence. The engineer focused on technical matters to avoid such philosophical complications, noting how the victim's breathing had adapted to account for restricted lung capacity as more of his torso submerged. The mechanism paused for scheduled maintenance, operators checking rope integrity, while the victim hung at chest depth in oil that had taken on darker coloration from its work. This interruption had been planned to extend the performance, but it created an unexpected tension as everyone waited for resumption. Regulus used the pause to turn his head slowly, that lidless gaze sweeping across the crowd with deliberate purpose. Those who met his eyes found themselves looking away first, disturbed by something that went beyond the physical horror of his condition. When the descent resumed, the oil had reached his shoulders, leaving only his head and bound arms above the surface. The heat rose in visible waves that distorted the air, making him appear to shimmer like a desert mirage. His wooden soldier had completed its transformation into charred memory, falling into the oil with a tiny splash that seemed impossibly loud in the relative quiet. The crowd held its collective breath as the final phase approached, everyone understanding that the performance's climax was moments away. The engineer gave the signal for the final sequence, ropes releasing in coordinated motion that would complete the descent in one smooth movement rather than continued increments. As Regulus's head approached the oil's surface, he drew one last breath that everyone in the amphitheatre heard with crystalline clarity. His eyes found the Carthaginian section where officials sat in their finery, and his lips moved with purpose despite the heat that had cracked them like dried mud. "Rome remembers everything," he said, the words emerging clear despite his body's destruction. "Your children will learn Latin from masters who haven't been born yet." The oil claimed him then in a rush of bubbles and steam, but the prophecy hung in the air like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. The crowd's roar of triumph fractured into something more complicated, as they processed what they'd heard, some cheering louder to drown out doubt, while others fell silent with sudden uncertainty. The engineer monitored the final submersion with professional detachment, ensuring complete immolation before signaling the mechanism to stop. The performance had achieved technical perfection, every calculation proven correct, every mechanical function operating within acceptable parameters. Yet something in the crowd's reaction suggested a different kind of failure, as if the elaborate execution had somehow elevated its victim rather than diminished him. The oil continued bubbling for several minutes after the body had fully submerged, gradually returning to its original clarity as organic matter completed its transformation. Guards prepared to disperse the crowd, but many lingered despite the show's conclusion, discussing what they'd witnessed in tones more suited to temple than entertainment. The engineer began dismantling his equipment, already planning improvements for future applications, though privately wondering if there would be demand for such elaborate demonstrations after today. Within hours, Marcia had assembled 19 Carthaginian prisoners in the forum, matching the number of Roman nobles Carthage held. She supervised their arrangement personally, ensuring each faced the direction where her husband had died, though Rome lay far from African shores. The mathematics of vengeance operated with different calculations than Carthaginian engineering, less precise but equally deliberate. By sunset, 19 new crosses lined the Appian Way, their occupants learning that Roman women could teach lessons about suffering that rivaled any foreign innovation. The Senate met in emergency session as reports of the execution spread through diplomatic channels. Fabius Maximus stood before the assembly with tears streaming down weathered cheeks, reading Regulus's final words as reported by Roman merchants who'd witnessed the spectacle. The chamber erupted in rage that transcended party divisions. Conservatives and populists united in determination that Carthage would pay for transforming Roman virtue into spectacle. War votes that had stalled for months passed unanimously, funded by senators emptying personal treasuries into military coffers. Marcus Minor enlisted the day after receiving confirmation of his father's death, joining legions already preparing for campaigns that would last another 17 years. He carried no wooden soldiers, only a list of names memorized from childhood stories. Carthaginian nobles who'd orchestrated the execution and would learn that Roman memory operated across generations. His brother Gaius, still too young for service, spent nights studying maps of Africa with intensity that worried their tutors, planning future campaigns with mathematical precision inherited from a father who'd calculated honor above survival. The transformation of Regulus from defeated general to martyred hero proceeded with momentum that surprised even Roman propagandists. Plays depicting his sacrifice appeared in every theatre, though none dared recreate the actual execution, settling for noble speeches about duty delivered before tastefully implied deaths. Children learned verses about choosing principle over comfort, though sanitized versions that emphasized moral lessons over mechanical horrors. His name became shorthand for the highest form of Roman virtue, the willingness to embrace destruction rather than compromise integrity. Carthaginian diplomats found their receptions in neutral cities suddenly hostile, former allies questioning the wisdom of association with a power that tortured ambassadors. The elaborate execution that had been designed to demonstrate strength instead revealed a cruelty that repulsed even hardened merchants who'd seen warfare's worst excesses. Trade agreements dissolved as partners sought distance from a reputation that now included calculated atrocity alongside military prowess. The engineer who'd designed the mechanism found his services no longer in demand, his technical brilliance overshadowed by the execution's political consequences. He spent his remaining years writing treatises on mechanical principles that no one read, his innovations abandoned as Carthage sought to distance itself from methods that had transformed a defeated enemy into an immortal symbol. His careful calculations had been correct in every physical detail, but had failed to account for the metaphysical weight of creating martyrs. 23 years after Regulus died in boiling oil, Scipio Africanus stood in the ruins of Carthage as Roman soldiers systematically destroyed every building, filled every harbour, salted every field. The general carried a wooden soldier, carved by his own father who'd heard the story from a witness, painted in careful detail despite never having seen the original. He placed it where the execution amphitheatre had stood, a small memorial to the man whose death had made this moment inevitable. Roman historians would argue for centuries about whether Regulus had planned his final words or spoken from inspiration in extremity. The debate missed the essential point that calculation and virtue had merged so completely in him that distinguishing between them no longer mattered. He'd transformed Carthaginian cruelty into Roman motivation, personal agony into generational purpose, mechanical execution into eternal principle. The prophecy proved accurate with mathematical precision. Carthaginian children did learn Latin from Roman masters, their own language fading into historical footnote while their conqueror's tongue spread across the known world. The names of those who'd orchestrated the execution vanished from memory, while Regulus joined the pantheon of exemplars cited whenever Romans needed reminding of their highest ideals. Marcia lived to see partial vindication, though age had silvered her hair and bent her spine by the time Carthage fell. She stood in the Senate as they read reports of the final destruction, her presence reminding everyone that some victories cost more than any nation should willingly pay. Her sons had both died in the African campaigns, the family line that Regulus had sacrificed himself to protect ending on the same shores where it had achieved its greatest honor. Modern excavations at Carthage occasionally unearth fragments that might have been part of execution devices, though nothing remains of the specific mechanism that claimed Regulus. Historians debate details that surviving accounts render unclear, arguing over temperatures and durations with academic passion that forgets the human cost of their subject matter. The physical facts matter less than the psychological impact, the transformation of elaborate cruelty into enduring symbol. In the end, Marcus Atilius Regulus achieved through dying what he'd failed to accomplish through living. His defeat at Tunis had been reversed by suffering that inspired 2 generations of Romans to fight with fury born from outrage. His inability to humble Carthage through siege had been answered by its complete obliteration by armies motivated by his memory. His capture had become the catalyst for victory more complete than any his legions might have won. The wooden soldier rests now in the Capitoline Museum, its authenticity debated but its symbolism clear. Carved by a father for a daughter, carried through torture that defied description, consumed in flames that transformed flesh but not meaning, recreated by those who understood its significance. It represents the personal cost of principles that build empires. Visitors pause before the small display, reading placards that explain historical context, while missing the essential truth that some choices echo across centuries. Regulus chose his death as carefully as he'd chosen his battles, understanding that martyrdom properly orchestrated could achieve what military might had failed to accomplish. The Carthaginians gave him the stage, the mechanism, the audience. He provided the performance that transformed execution into inspiration, personal ending into cultural beginning. The oil that consumed his body lit fires in Roman hearts that wouldn't be extinguished until Carthage itself had been reduced to ash and memory. He'd known from the moment they offered him terms what his answer would cost, had calculated the price and paid it in full because anything less would have been the actual defeat.